Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into a world most history books forgot to mention. Picture this, New York City, 1890. The richest families in America are at war, not with guns or armies, but with something far more ruthless. Ballroom invitations, diamond tiaras, and one woman who held the power to destroy your entire future with a single word. No. Her name was Caroline Schermerhorn Astor. And for nearly 40 years, she was more powerful than any president, any businessman, any man in America, because she decided who mattered and who did not. Tonight, you are going to meet the woman who invented high society as we know it, the woman who created rules so strict that millionaires would literally beg for her approval. And the fascinating part? She did it all without a college degree, without a business empire, without ever running for office, just pure calculated social power. So before we step into Mrs. Astor's glittering world together, I have a small favour to ask. If you are someone who loves untold stories about powerful women who shaped history, then this channel was made for you. Hit that subscribe button and leave a like if you are already feeling intrigued. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you are watching from right now. Are you in New York? London? Maybe somewhere totally unexpected? I genuinely want to know. Now dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background sound, and let us travel back to a time when being invited to the right party could change your life forever. Let me set the scene for you. 1870. New York is exploding with new wealth. The Civil War just ended. Railroads are being built across the country, factories are booming, and suddenly there are millionaires everywhere. Not the old money families who've been around since the Dutch settlers. No, these are brand new fortunes. Railroad barons, steel magnates, oil tycoons, men who made their money fast and wanted everyone to know it. But here is the thing about New York high society at that time. The old families, the ones whose ancestors arrived on the Mayflower or founded New Amsterdam, they were not impressed by new money. They had something these newly rich people desperately wanted: legitimacy, acceptance, the kind of social status that money alone could not buy. And that is where our story really begins. With a woman who understood this power dynamic better than anyone else. Caroline Schermerhorn was born in 1830 to exactly the kind of family that mattered. The Schermerhorns were Dutch aristocracy. Her ancestors were among the original settlers of New York when it was still called New Amsterdam. Her family was in the shipping business, and when Caroline was born, her father was worth $500,000. Now, that might not sound like much, but in today's money, that is nearly $15 million, just for existing, just for being born into the right family. Caroline grew up knowing she was special, not because she did anything remarkable, but because her bloodline was pure, old money, untainted by the dirty work of actually earning it. And in 1853, when she was 23 years old, she married William Backhouse Astor Jr. Now, you might think she married up. After all, the Astors were probably the richest family in America. But here is the twist that tells you everything about Caroline. Everyone agreed that she was the one with the superior pedigree. The Astors had money, sure, massive amounts of it. But Caroline had something better. She had that unquestionable old New York bloodline, and that distinction, that is what she would spend the next 40 years weaponizing into absolute social power. Let me tell you about her husband for a moment, because it is kind of fascinating. William Astor had zero interest in his wife's social ambitions. Zero. While Caroline was plotting to take over New York society, William was sailing his yacht as far away from New York as humanly possible. He would disappear for months. Some historians think he just could not stand the social circus his wife was creating. Others think he was perfectly happy to let her have that world while he lived his own life. Either way, Caroline did not need his help. She had her own money from her parents, and that is actually a huge deal. Most women in the 1800s were completely dependent on their husbands financially. But not Caroline. She had her own inheritance, which meant she had independence, real power, the kind most women of her era could only dream about. In 1862, she and William built this massive brownstone mansion at 350 Fifth Avenue, right where the Empire State Building stands today, if you can believe that. 4 stories tall, built in the latest fashion, and most importantly, it had a ballroom. A very specific ballroom that could hold exactly 400 people. Now, I need you to understand something about that ballroom. It was not just a room, it was a weapon. It was the physical manifestation of who mattered in America and who did not. Because if you could not fit inside that ballroom, you literally did not exist in Caroline Astor's world. But the house in New York was just the beginning. The Astors also had what they called a summer cottage in Newport, Rhode Island. And when I say cottage, I mean a massive mansion called Beechwood, because that is what rich people in the 1890s called their vacation homes. Cottages. Beechwood also had a ballroom, also designed to hold exactly 400 people. Seeing a pattern here? For the first couple decades of her marriage, Caroline was actually pretty focused on what most women of her class were expected to do, raising her 5 children, running her household, the usual stuff. But here is what made her different. She was watching, learning, waiting, because she saw something happening in New York that nobody else quite understood yet. The city was changing, fast. After the Civil War, the population was exploding, immigrants were flooding in from all over Europe. And more importantly, all these new millionaires were showing up. Families from Chicago, from San Francisco, from the Midwest. People who made fortunes in railroads and mining and manufacturing. And they wanted in. They wanted to be part of New York society. But the old families, the ones who had been running things quietly for generations, they were horrified. These newcomers were so vulgar, so flashy. They threw enormous parties. They built ridiculous mansions. They wore their wealth like a costume. Everything about them screamed, "Look how rich I am." And the old guard absolutely hated it. Except Caroline saw an opportunity. Because all this chaos meant there was a vacuum. Someone needed to create order. Someone needed to establish rules. Someone needed to decide who was acceptable and who was not. And Caroline Astor decided that someone would be her. Around 1872, when her mother-in-law died, Caroline essentially appointed herself the gatekeeper of New York high society. And here is the genius part. She did not ask anyone's permission. She just started acting like she had the authority, and everyone went along with it. Why? Because she had exactly the right combination of things. Old family bloodline, massive Astor fortune, and most importantly the absolute confidence that she deserved this role. She started hosting these incredibly elaborate parties. But not just anyone could attend. Oh no! You needed an official calling card from Mrs. Astor herself. Not from Caroline, not from Mrs. William Astor. Just Mrs. Astor. As if there was only one woman in all of New York who mattered enough to be called by that title alone. And honestly, that is exactly how it worked out. For the next 30 years, if you said Mrs. Astor, everyone knew exactly who you meant. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, the woman who decided your social fate. Now, here is where it gets really interesting. Caroline needed help executing her vision, because maintaining absolute social control over the richest city in America is actually exhausting work. So she teamed up with this guy named Ward McAllister. And Ward is honestly one of the most fascinating characters in this whole story. Ward McAllister was distantly related to the Astors, so he had the bloodline credentials, but he was also completely obsessed with high society. Like pathologically obsessed. He loved everything about it. The rules, the etiquette, the exclusivity. He was basically a social climber's worst nightmare, because he knew all the codes and he would gatekeep them viciously. Caroline and Ward came up with this concept together. They decided that fashionable New York society consisted of exactly 400 people. Not 401, not 399, exactly 400. And that number was allegedly based on how many people could fit in Mrs. Astor's ballroom. But here is the thing. Lots of rooms in New York could hold 400 people. Delmonico's restaurant, various ballrooms around the city. So why exactly 400? Because it sounded official, it sounded scientific, it sounded like there was actual logic behind it. When really it was just Caroline and Ward deciding that they liked the number 400 because it sounded exclusive enough. In 1888, McAllister gave an interview to the New York Tribune, and he said this, and I want you to really hear this quote because it is absolutely wild. He said, "If you go outside that number, you strike people who are either not at ease in a ballroom or else make other people not at ease." Think about that for a second. 400 people in a city of millions. And according to Ward McAllister, everyone else was literally too uncomfortable or uncomfortable making to belong in polite society. The audacity of that statement is almost beautiful in its cruelty. But Caroline and Ward did not stop there. They created actual rules, written rules, for who could be part of the 400. First, you had to be separated by at least 3 generations from the person who originally made your family's money. So if your grandfather was the one who built the railroad fortune, sorry, you're out. Too new. Come back in a generation or 2. Second, you needed to have a minimum of $1 million in cash, not tied up in businesses or properties. Actual liquid cash that you could spend. In 1890s money, that is the equivalent of about $30 million today. So we are not talking about comfortable wealth. We are talking about stupid, absurd levels of money. And third, you could never ever forget the rules of etiquette. You had to know exactly how to dress for every occasion. You had to know who to call on and when. You had to attend the right events and avoid the wrong ones. One mistake, one social misstep, and you could be dropped from the list permanently. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. This all sounds incredibly shallow and stupid. Why would anyone care about being on some arbitrary list created by a bored housewife and her social climbing friend? But here is the thing you have to understand. In the 1890s, this stuff mattered enormously because social connections were everything. If you were not accepted by the right people, your daughters could not marry into the right families. Your sons could not get into the right clubs. Your business deals would suffer because nobody in the inner circle would trust you. Being excluded from the 400 was not just embarrassing. It was financially and socially devastating. And Caroline Astor understood this power better than anyone. She knew that what she was really controlling was not just party invitations. She was controlling access to the entire power structure of America's wealthiest class. Every January, Caroline would host her annual ball, and receiving an invitation to that ball was like getting a golden ticket to Willy Wonka's factory, except instead of chocolate, you got social legitimacy. People would wait by their mailboxes, literally shaking with anxiety, hoping their invitation would arrive, and if it did not come, that was it. Your social season was over. Your family's reputation was tarnished. All because one woman decided you were not good enough. The thing is, Caroline did not make these decisions randomly. She had very specific ideas about what made someone acceptable. Old money was obviously best, but she would grudgingly accept new money if they proved themselves worthy. And how did you prove yourself worthy? By following all her rules perfectly, by never making a scene, by wearing the right clothes, saying the right things, knowing exactly how to behave in her ballroom. She favoured dark colours at her parties, usually black but sometimes regal purple, and she would show up absolutely dripping in diamonds. I am talking multiple necklaces, tiaras, bracelets, rings. The woman looked like a walking jewellery store. And that was the point. She wanted everyone to look at her and remember exactly who had the power in that room. Let me tell you about a typical evening at one of Mrs. Astor's balls, because it was quite the production. First, you would receive your invitation weeks in advance. Heavy card stock, elegant calligraphy, your name handwritten by Mrs. Astor's personal secretary. Just holding that invitation made you part of an exclusive club. On the night of the ball, you would arrive at 350 Fifth Avenue in your finest clothes, the men in white tie and tails, the women in elaborate gowns that cost more than most people made in a year. You would be announced as you entered, your name called out for everyone to hear, and then you would make your way through the crowd looking for Mrs. Astor herself. And there she would be, usually positioned in a spot where everyone had to pass by her, wearing her diamonds and her black dress, and this expression that was somehow both welcoming and completely intimidating. You would curtsy or bow, she would nod, maybe say a few words, and that interaction, those 30 seconds in her presence, would determine how the rest of your social season went. If she smiled warmly, you were golden. If she was merely polite, you were on probation. And if she turned away without really acknowledging you, start packing. Your time in New York society was over. The parties themselves were elaborate beyond belief. Orchestras playing, champagne flowing, tables absolutely overflowing with expensive food. Oysters and caviar and imported delicacies that cost more than a working person's annual salary. And everyone dressed in their absolute finest, competing to see who could display the most wealth without looking like they were trying too hard. Because that was the paradox of the whole thing. You had to show your wealth, but you also had to act like it was no big deal. Like, of course you had a $5,000 gown. Like, obviously your jewelry came from Paris. Like, naturally you spent your summers in Newport and your winters traveling through Europe. It had to look effortless, casual, as if being extraordinarily wealthy was just the normal way of existing. And Caroline Astor, she was the master of this performance. She made it look like she was born to rule New York society, which in a way she was. Her whole life prepared her for this role, and she played it perfectly for almost 40 years. But here is what I find most interesting about Caroline's reign. She was not just a figurehead. She was not just some rich lady throwing parties. She was genuinely strategic. She understood power dynamics in a way that most people never do. She knew that the key to maintaining power was not just saying no to everyone. It was knowing exactly when to say yes. Because sometimes Caroline would surprise everyone. She would approve someone that no one expected. Someone with new money, or someone from the Midwest, or someone who did not seem to fit all the criteria. And by doing that, she kept everyone guessing. She kept everyone trying to figure out her formula. And as long as people were trying to figure out her rules, she remained powerful. Think about it like this. If Caroline had just said only old New York families, no exceptions ever, people would have eventually stopped caring. They would have created their own social circles. But by occasionally letting in carefully chosen outsiders, she kept the game interesting. She kept people believing that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. It is kind of brilliant in a manipulative sort of way. Now I want to compare this to something you might be more familiar with. Think about the Met Gala. Every year everyone obsesses over who gets invited, who wears what, who sits where. Anna Wintour controls the guest list with absolute authority. One woman deciding who matters in fashion and entertainment. Sound familiar? Caroline Astor basically invented this. She was the Anna Wintour of the 1890s. Except instead of the Met Gala, it was her annual ball. And instead of Vogue magazine backing her up, she had the entire weight of old New York society and unlimited Astor money. The lesson here is actually pretty timeless. Real power does not come from having the most money. It comes from controlling access to something people desperately want. Caroline did not need to be the richest person in New York. She just needed to be the person who could decide who got to be part of the most exclusive group in America. And she held on to that power with an iron grip for decades. But nothing lasts forever. And by the late 1880s, there were cracks forming in Caroline's perfect system. New families were getting too rich to ignore. The Vanderbilts especially were becoming a problem, because they had so much money that they could not be dismissed. They could build bigger houses, throw more elaborate parties, buy more expensive art and jewellery. They could do everything the old families could do, just bigger and louder. And Caroline was going to have to make a choice. Keep her precious circle small and watch it become irrelevant, or let the new money in and change everything she had built. In 1883, that choice was about to be forced on her in the most dramatic way possible, by a woman who refused to take no for an answer. A woman who would change the entire game of New York society forever. But that's a story for next time, because right now I want you to sit with this image. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, standing in her ballroom, wearing her diamonds like armour, looking out at the 400 people she deemed worthy of existence, knowing that with a single word, with a single decision, she could destroy someone's entire life, and loving every second of that power. That is real power, is it not? Not the kind that comes from armies or governments, but the kind that comes from understanding exactly what people want and controlling their access to it. Next, we are going to talk about the woman who cracked Caroline's code. The woman who forced Mrs. Astor to do something she had never done before. Surrender. And trust me, the way she did it. Pure genius. You're not going to want to miss this. So let us talk about the woman who broke the unbreakable system. Her name was Alva Erskine Smith, and she was born in 1853 in Mobile, Alabama. Now right away that tells you something important. She was not from New York, she was not Dutch aristocracy, she was Southern. And in the world of New York high society, that might as well have made her Martian. But Alva had something that most Southern girls did not have. Her family had money. Her father was a cotton broker and a merchant who did quite well before the Civil War. So Alva grew up comfortable, privileged, used to nice things, but then the war happened, and like so many Southern families, they lost everything. By the time Alva was a teenager, her family had to move to New York just to survive, and I want you to imagine what that must have felt like for her, going from being a wealthy Southern belle to being basically nobody in New York. Having to watch from the outside as these old money families lived their glamorous lives, knowing that no matter how smart she was, no matter how beautiful, no matter how charming, she would never be invited to their parties, never be accepted into their world. That kind of rejection, it either breaks you or it makes you absolutely determined to win. And Alva chose determination. In 1875, when she was 22 years old, Alva married William Kissam Vanderbilt. Now let me tell you about the Vanderbilt family for a moment, because they were absolutely central to this whole story. The Vanderbilt fortune started with Cornelius Vanderbilt, who everyone called the Commodore. He made his money in steamships and then in railroads, and we're not talking about just being rich. By the time the Commodore died in 1877, he left behind $95 million. In today's money, that is roughly $2.5 billion, the largest private fortune in America at the time. But here is the thing about the Vanderbilts. The old New York families absolutely despised them. Why? Because the Commodore was rough, crude. He swore constantly. He did not care about manners or etiquette. He came from Staten Island farming stock. He made his money through ruthless business practices that earned him the nickname a robber baron. Everything about him screamed new money in the worst possible way. And as far as Caroline Astor was concerned, railroad money was the lowest form of wealth. It was dirty, tainted, earned through actual work rather than inherited through good breeding. She found the whole Vanderbilt family distasteful. So when Alva Smith married Willie K. Vanderbilt, she knew exactly what she was getting into. She was marrying into a family with unlimited money but zero social acceptance. The Vanderbilts could not get invited to the right parties. Their daughters could not marry into the old families. They were stuck on the outside looking in, no matter how many millions they had. But Alva saw this as an opportunity, because she understood something that most people did not. Money might not be able to buy acceptance directly, but money could buy leverage, and leverage could force acceptance. Let me tell you about Alva for a second, because she was absolutely fascinating. She was tiny, just barely 5 feet tall, but she had this enormous personality, strong-willed, ambitious, absolutely fearless. Her friends described her as having more energy than any 3 normal people combined. And she had this vision, this absolute certainty that she was going to break into New York society no matter what it took. Willie K. Vanderbilt, on the other hand, he was pretty easygoing. He liked horses, he liked yachts, he liked having a good time. Social climbing was not really his thing, but Alva made it her full-time job. And in 1880, she started putting her plan into action. First, she convinced Willie to let her commission a house. Not just any house, a mansion, a palace, really, on 5th Avenue at 52nd Street. She hired Richard Morris Hunt, who was basically the most fashionable architect in America at the time, and she told him she wanted something that would make every other house in New York look boring by comparison. What Hunt designed for her was absolutely insane. A French chateau, limestone, turrets, Gothic details. It cost $3 million to build. That is about $90 million today for one house in the city. But here is the genius part. Alva was not just building a house, she was building a statement. She was saying, you can ignore the Vanderbilts if you want, but you cannot ignore this. The house took 3 years to build, and during those 3 years, Alva was plotting, planning, waiting for exactly the right moment to make her move. That moment came in March of 1883. Alva announced that she was going to host a housewarming ball, a costume ball, and it was going to be the most elaborate, most expensive, most spectacular party New York had ever seen. Now costume balls were already fashionable at the time. Rich people loved any excuse to dress up in ridiculous outfits and show off their wealth. But Alva took it to a completely different level. She invited 1,200 guests. 1,200. That is 3 times the size of Mrs. Astor's exclusive 400. She hired Jose Maria Mora, the most famous photographer in New York, to photograph everyone's costumes. She commissioned elaborate decorations. She hired full orchestras. The preparations took months, and the whole time New York society was buzzing with gossip about what this party was going to be like. But here is the thing. Alva had not invited the Astors. Well, not exactly. She had invited everyone else. All the old families, all the new families, all the social climbers and wannabes. But she very conspicuously had not sent an invitation to Caroline Astor or her family. Now Caroline had a daughter. Her youngest daughter, also named Caroline, but called Carrie by the family. And Carrie was at that perfect age where going to the right parties absolutely mattered. She was being prepared for her debut into society, and all of her friends had been invited to Alva's ball. All of Carrie's friends were planning their costumes, talking about what they would wear, who they would dance with. It was the only thing anyone could talk about. And poor Carrie Astor could not go because her mother had never officially called on Alva Vanderbilt. You see, there was this rule in high society. Before you could attend someone's party, your mother had to have officially visited their house and left a calling card. It was part of the whole elaborate etiquette system. And Caroline Astor had never, would never, could never lower herself to call on a Vanderbilt, except Carrie was apparently miserable, though. All her friends going to this amazing party, and she had to stay home because of her mother's pride. And young Carrie did what any teenager would do. She begged, she pleaded, she probably cried. And eventually she broke her mother down. Or maybe, just maybe, Carolyn realised that Alva had outplayed her. Because by not sending an invitation, Alva had created a situation where Caroline had to make a choice. Maintain her dignity and look petty for excluding her daughter from the social event of the year, or swallow her pride and acknowledge Alva's existence. In late March of 1883, Caroline Schermerhorn Astor did something she had never done before, and would probably never do again. She got in her carriage, rode across town, and officially called on Mrs. William K. Vanderbilt. Can you imagine that moment? The most powerful woman in New York society pulling up to this nouveau riche mansion and leaving her calling card like some common social climber. It must have killed her inside. But Alva had won. The very next day an invitation arrived at the Astor house. Carrie could go to the ball. And let me tell you about this ball, because it was absolutely legendary. The party happened on March 26, 1883, and it was everything Alva promised and more. The house was decorated like something out of a fairy tale, flowers everywhere, lights glittering, rooms transformed into different themes. The costumes were absolutely insane. People spent months planning them, thousands of dollars on a single outfit that they would wear for one night. Alva herself dressed as a Venetian princess. Her dress was white and gold brocade with a 5-foot train. She wore ropes of pearls and diamonds. She looked like actual royalty. One guest, Amy Townsend, came as the fairy queen from the opera Iolanthe. The newspapers described her costume in detail. Creamy white cashmere embroidered in gold. A long train, low-cut waist that formed glittering gold armour. 3 ropes of diamonds across the front. Wings made of gold-spangled tulle springing from her shoulders. A diamond necklace. A star of diamonds in her hair, and she carried a gold wand. That is what people wore to a party. Let that sink in for a second. Alice Vanderbilt, who was married to Willie's brother Cornelius, came dressed as Electric Light. Because electricity was brand new and exciting, and what better way to show you were modern and wealthy than to dress up as a technological innovation? Her costume was covered in actual light bulbs powered by batteries hidden in her dress. The party lasted until dawn. There was a professional orchestra, there was a ballet performance, there was so much champagne that nobody could even guess how much was consumed. The supper alone cost tens of thousands of dollars, and the next day every newspaper in New York wrote about it. The social pages, the gossip columns, everyone was talking about Alva Vanderbilt's ball, about how spectacular it was, about how it was the social event of the decade. More importantly, everyone was talking about how Mrs. Astor had attended, how she had been there with her daughter, publicly acknowledging Alva Vanderbilt as her social equal. That was the moment everything changed. Because if Mrs. Astor accepted the Vanderbilts, then everyone else had to accept them too. That was how the system worked. Caroline had the power to exclude, but she also had the power to include. And by attending that ball, she had officially opened the doors of New York society to the Vanderbilt family. But here is what I find most interesting about this whole situation. Alva did not just get invited to parties after this. She did not just become accepted. Over the next 20 years, she basically took over. She became one of the most powerful women in New York society. Eventually, after Caroline Astor died, Alva would be one of the 3 women who filled her role. How did she do it? By understanding the rules better than anyone else. By knowing exactly where the weak points in the system were. By being willing to play the game harder and smarter than everyone else. Think about the psychology of what she did. She did not beg for acceptance. She did not try to prove she was worthy. She created a situation where Caroline Astor had to choose between her pride and her daughter's happiness, between maintaining a pointless social barrier and doing what any mother would do. That is brilliant strategy. Alva did not attack the system head-on. She found the emotional weak point and exploited it perfectly. And the thing is, once the Vanderbilts were in, they did not just participate in New York society, they reshaped it. Because they had more money than almost anyone else. They could build bigger houses, throw more elaborate parties, commission more expensive art. They raised the stakes of everything. Alva went on to build multiple mansions in New York, in Newport, Rhode Island, where she built Marble House, which cost $11 million and took 2 years just to decorate the interior. That is over $300 million in today's money for a summer house. She became a trendsetter. Whatever Alva did, other wealthy women tried to copy. She introduced new fashions from Paris. She changed how parties were organized. She made it acceptable to be bold and ambitious in ways that old New York society never would have allowed. But probably her most controversial move came in 1895 when she divorced Willie K. Vanderbilt. Divorce was absolutely scandalous in the 1890s. Nice women did not get divorced, especially not women in high society. It was social suicide. Except for Alva, it was not. Because by that point she was too powerful, too wealthy, too well connected. She got her divorce, kept her position in society, and then did something even more shocking. She remarried to Oliver Belmont, who was a friend of the family, and she kept right on being a social leader. Think about that for a second. She broke one of the biggest rules of Victorian society and faced basically no consequences. That is how much power she had accumulated. Later in her life, Alva became a passionate advocate for women's suffrage. She used her wealth and influence to support the movement for women to get the right to vote. She held fundraisers, she gave speeches. She basically said, if I could break into New York society, women can certainly get the right to vote. And honestly, that arc is fascinating to me. She went from this outsider desperately trying to be accepted to being one of the most powerful women in America, to using that power for something beyond just social climbing. She used it for political change. Now, does that make her a hero? I do not know. She forced her daughter Consuelo into a loveless marriage with a British duke just to cement the family's social position. She could be ruthless, manipulative, absolutely obsessed with status and power. But she was also a woman who refused to accept the limitations society tried to place on her, who saw an impossible barrier and figured out a way to break through it. What do you think? Was Alva Vanderbilt a villain or a hero? Drop a comment and let me know, because I genuinely find her complicated in the most interesting way. But here is the bigger lesson from Alva's story. The rules that seem unbreakable, usually they are not. The systems that seem impenetrable, usually they have weak points. You just have to be smart enough to find them and brave enough to exploit them. Caroline Astor built this entire structure of social control. She made it seem like the rules were absolute and unchangeable. But Alva proved that even the most rigid system has cracks, and if you push on those cracks in exactly the right way, the whole thing can shift. After that 1883 ball, New York society was never quite the same. More new money families started getting accepted. The old barriers started breaking down. And while Caroline Astor still had power, she had to share it in ways she never did before. Of course, Caroline was not happy about any of this. She spent the next 25 years watching her perfect system slowly crumble. Watching as more Vanderbilts, more railroad families, more mining fortunes, more new money poured into her exclusive world. And by 1908, when Caroline finally died, the social landscape had changed completely. The old guard was losing power. A new generation was taking over. And it would take not one but 3 women to fill the void Caroline left behind. 3 women who would form what everyone called the Triumvirate. 3 social queens who would rule New York and Newport with even more flair, more drama and more scandal than Caroline ever did. And Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, she was one of them. But she was not alone. Because alongside her were 2 other women with their own fascinating stories. One was known for her cutting wit and outrageous parties. The other was a drill sergeant in diamonds who enforced the rules with military precision. Together, they created a completely different kind of high society, one that was younger, bolder, and infinitely more entertaining, and we are going to meet them next. October 30th, 1908. Caroline Schermerhorn. Astor died at her home on Fifth Avenue. She was 78 years old, and for almost 40 years she had been the undisputed ruler of American high society. The newspapers ran elaborate obituaries. They called her the Queen of New York. They described her diamonds, her parties, her absolute authority over who mattered and who did not. But what the newspapers did not say, what nobody wanted to admit out loud, was that by the time Caroline died, her power had already faded. She spent her last few years in what one writer called splendid isolation, barely leaving her mansion, suffering from what we would now recognize as dementia. In 1905, she fell down the marble staircase in her home. Servants found her unconscious, blood in her white hair. She never really recovered from that fall. Her mind started going. She would forget where she was, who people were. Sometimes she thought she was still hosting her famous balls, still ruling over her 400. It must have been heartbreaking. This woman who built her entire identity on being in complete control, losing control of her own mind. But even before her death, even before that terrible fall, Caroline's grip on society had been slipping. Because the world was changing. The old rules did not work anymore. There were too many new millionaires, too much new money, too many people who refused to play by the old guard's restrictions, and nature abhors a vacuum. So when Caroline finally died, when that throne was officially empty, 3 women stepped up to fill it. Not one woman, 3, because apparently it took 3 people to do what Caroline had done alone. They called themselves the Triumvirate, and honestly, they were perfect for the role, because each of them brought something different to the table, different personalities, different styles, different approaches to power. Together, they created something bigger and more interesting than what Caroline had built. The first was Alva, who we already talked about. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont by this point, since she had remarried after divorcing Willie Kay. She was the builder, the visionary, the one who was always pushing boundaries, always creating something new and shocking. The second was Marion Graves Anthon Fish. Everyone called her Mamie, and Mamie was the entertainer, the one who made high society fun instead of just stuffy and formal. She had this wicked sense of humour, absolutely zero filter. And the third was Theresa Fair Elricks. Everyone called her Tessie. She was the enforcer, the drill sergeant, the one who made sure everyone followed the rules, even if those rules were different from Caroline Astor's rules. 3 women, 3 completely different approaches to power, and together they dominated New York and Newport society for the next 2 decades. Let me tell you about Mamie first, because she is honestly one of my favourite characters in this whole story. Mamie Fish was born Marion Graves Anthon in 1853 on Staten Island. Her father was a successful lawyer, so she came from a respectable family, but not one of the super elite old money families. She was comfortable but not obscenely wealthy. Here is the interesting part. Mamie received very little formal education. Some sources say she could barely read or write. Now, I do not know if that is completely true or just gossip, but what is definitely true is that she did not have the classical education that most women of her class received. No French tutors, no piano lessons, no finishing school in Europe. But what Mamie did have was personality, charisma, and the quickest wit in New York. She could deliver an insult so cleverly that you would not even realize you had been insulted until 5 minutes later, and by then, everyone else would be laughing. In 1876, when she was 23, Mamie married Stuyvesant Fish. And Stuyvesant was perfect for her because he was incredibly wealthy but also pretty easygoing. He was the president of the National Park Bank of New York and heavily involved in railroads. Money was not an issue for them, not even close. But Mamie did not come from Vanderbilt-level wealth. She was not swimming in hundreds of millions like some of her friends. and she knew she could never compete on that level. So instead of trying to throw the most expensive parties, she decided to throw the most entertaining ones. Mamie styled herself as a fun maker. That is what she called herself, a fun maker, and she meant it literally. Her entire approach to high society was to make it less boring, less predictable, less obsessed with rigid etiquette, and more focused on having an actual good time. She was famous for her cutting remarks. There are so many great Mamie Fish quotes, and I want to share a few with you because they really capture her personality. About First Lady Edith Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's wife, Mamie supposedly said, "It is said she dresses on $300 a year and she looks it." Can you imagine saying that about the First Lady? The audacity, the shade, I love it. At her dinner parties, Mamie would sometimes greet guests with insults instead of pleasantries. She would say things like, "Oh, how do you do? I'd quite forgotten I asked you," right to their face as they walked in the door. Now, you might think that would make people not want to come to her parties, but it had the opposite effect. Everyone wanted an invitation to a Mamie Fish party because you never knew what was going to happen. It was theatre, entertainment. She turned high society into performance art. She threw the most outrageous parties. At one event, the guest of honour was a monkey, an actual monkey dressed up and introduced as Prince del Drago of Corsica. The monkey sat at the head of the table while society ladies pretended to have polite conversation with it. It was absurd, ridiculous, and absolutely hilarious. At another party, she had an elephant, a full-sized elephant sharing the dance floor with her guests. Because why not? If you have enough money and enough nerve, apparently you can just rent an elephant for your party. Mamie understood something important about human nature. People do not just want luxury, they want novelty. They want to be entertained. They want to tell their friends about the crazy thing that happened at last night's party, and Mamie gave them that. But underneath all the humour and the outrageous stunts, Mamie was actually quite strategic. She used humour as a weapon. If you were on her good side, her jokes made you feel included, part of the inner circle. But if she decided she did not like you, she could destroy your reputation with a single well-placed comment, and she would do it in a way that made everyone laugh, so you could not even complain about it without looking petty. One story I love is about her relationship with money. Mamie once said, completely seriously, "We are only moderately well off. We have but a few $1 million. A few $1 million. Moderately well off." That perspective is just wild to me, but it also shows you how extreme wealth had become in this world. When you're hanging out with the Vanderbilts and the Astors, a few million really does seem moderate by comparison. Now, let us talk about Tessie Elrics, because if Mamie was all about fun and humour, Tessie was all about rules and standards. Theresa Fair was born in 1871 in Virginia City, Nevada, and her origin story is actually fascinating because it is so different from the other women in this group. Her father was James Graham Fair. He was an Irish immigrant who came to America as a child. By the time he was 12, he was working in mines. He spent years prospecting for gold in California and Nevada. And in 1873, when Tessie was just 2 years old, her father and his partners discovered what they called the Big Bonanza. The Big Bonanza was the largest single deposit of gold and silver ever found in North America. We are talking about more than $100 million worth of gold and silver. In 1870s money, that is over $2.5 billion today, from one mine. James Fair went from being a hard-working prospector to one of the richest men in America basically overnight, and he did not handle it well. He became difficult, controlling. His marriage fell apart. There was a bitter divorce and custody battle over Tessie and her siblings. So Tessie grew up with enormous wealth but a deeply dysfunctional family. Her father was rich but emotionally unavailable. Her parents hated each other, and she learned early on that money could not buy happiness or stability. In 1889, when Tessie was 18, she was spending a summer in Newport, Rhode Island. That is where all the wealthy families went in the summer. And one day at the casino, which was this exclusive club where everyone played tennis and socialized, she met Herman Oelrichs. Herman came from a respectable New York family. He was in the steamship business. He was on Mrs. Astor's 400 list. He had good social credentials, but compared to Tessie's family wealth, his fortune was modest. Nice, but not spectacular. They married the following year in 1890. It was a huge society wedding in San Francisco, and here is a detail that tells you everything about Tessie's relationship with her father. James Fair gave his daughter $1 million as a wedding gift. $1 million. But he was not invited to the wedding. Tessie excluded him because of how he had treated her mother during the divorce. Can you imagine? Your father gives you what would be about $30 million today, and you still do not want him at your wedding. That takes a special kind of hurt and anger. Tessie moved to New York after the marriage. She had all the money she needed to establish herself in society, and she had Herman's social connections, plus she was young and beautiful and fashionable. She should have been perfectly positioned to become a social leader, but she had to overcome one major obstacle. She was from the West, from mining camps and nouveau riche Western wealth. Even though her money was just as good as anyone else's, the Eastern establishment looked down on Western fortunes, so Tessie did something brilliant. In 1899, she orchestrated the marriage of her younger sister Virginia, nicknamed Birdie, to William K. Vanderbilt Jr. That is right, Alva Vanderbilt's son. By arranging that marriage, Tessie essentially allied herself with the most powerful new money family in America, and that secured her place in the Triumvirate. Tessie built a mansion in Newport called Rosecliff. She commissioned Stanford White, who was the most famous architect of the era, to design it. The house was modelled after the Grand Trianon at Versailles. It took from 1899 to 1902 to complete. The final cost was $2.5 million. That is about $75 million in today's money for a summer house. But what made Tessie special was not just her wealth or her mansion, it was her personality. People described her as strongly addicted to society as business. She took it seriously, professionally, like it was a job she needed to excel at. Where Mamie was the fun one and Alva was the visionary, Tessie was the enforcer, the drill sergeant in diamonds. If there were rules to follow, Tessie made sure everyone followed them. If there was etiquette to maintain, Tessie maintained it. She was the one who decided who was in and who was out, but she did it with military precision. And here is something sad. Tessie's marriage to Herman was not happy. They were estranged for most of their married life. They stayed together publicly, maintaining appearances, but privately they barely spoke. When the massive San Francisco earthquake happened in 1906, Tessie heard that Herman had survived, and she apparently hoped it might bring them back together. She prepared this elaborate reconciliation dinner. Herman never showed up. A few years later, Herman died suddenly of a heart attack, and because they had been estranged, his will left most of his fortune to his brother instead of to Tessie. She had to contest the will in court. Eventually, she got half of his estate, but the whole situation was messy and public and probably humiliating. So you had these three women, Alva, who had fought her way into society and was now fighting for women's suffrage, Mamie, who was making high society entertaining and breaking all the boring old rules, and Tessie, who was enforcing the new standards and maintaining order in a changing world. Together, they were formidable because they covered all the bases. Alva brought the vision and the boldness, Mamie brought the charm and the social connections, Tessie brought the organizational skills and the discipline, and they did something Caroline Astor never quite managed. They made high society exciting again. Caroline's approach was all about exclusion and rigidity, but the Triumvirate, they were about spectacle, drama, entertainment. Yes, there were still rules. Yes, you still needed their approval, but it was more fun, more dynamic, more unpredictable. Think about it from a sociological perspective. Caroline Astor represented the old world, inherited status, fixed hierarchies, everyone in their proper place. But by the early 1900s, that world was dying. America was becoming more democratic, more fluid, more open to change, and the Triumvirate represented that shift. They still had power, but they wielded it differently, more creatively, more flexibly. Of course, they were not perfect. They could be just as cruel as Caroline ever was. They destroyed reputations. They excluded people arbitrarily. They enforced standards that were often ridiculous. Mamie's humour could be vicious. Tessie's enforcement could be harsh. Alva's ambition could be ruthless. But they were also more interesting than Caroline. They had bigger personalities. They took more risks. They pushed more boundaries. And in doing so, they kept high society relevant for another generation. Here is a question for you. If you could have dinner with one of these three women, who would you choose? The funny one, the strict one, or the revolutionary one? Let me know in the comments, because I honestly cannot decide. The Triumvirate ruled Newport and New York together for about 2 decades. They set fashion trends. They decided who was acceptable. They threw the parties everyone wanted to attend, and they did it all with more flair and more drama than Caroline Astor ever dreamed of. But of course, the Triumvirate could not last forever. Mamie died in 1915. Tessie died in 1926. Alva hung on until 1933, still fighting for women's rights until the end. And by the time they were gone, the world had changed completely. World War I happened. The Roaring Twenties happened. Women got the right to vote. Society became more democratic. The old barriers broke down almost completely. But before we talk about how it all ended, I want to take you deeper into their world, because understanding the Triumvirate is not just about knowing who they were. It is about understanding how they lived, the rituals, the routines, the elaborate social machinery that consumed their entire existence. What did a day in the life of a high society woman actually look like? What were the rules they followed? What did they wear? Where did they go? How did they spend their time? Because when you understand the daily reality of this world, you start to see both how absurd it was and how much genuine skill and effort it required. Let me take you through a typical day during the social season in Newport. Imagine waking up in a mansion overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. It is July 1895. You are in Newport, Rhode Island, and you're about to spend the next 16 hours following rules so complicated, so specific, so absolutely exhausting that you will collapse into bed tonight wondering why anyone would voluntarily choose this life. Welcome to the social season. The social season ran from November to the beginning of Lent in the city. But summers were for Newport, and Newport was where the real action happened, where reputations were made and destroyed, where the Triumvirate held court, where every single moment of your day was choreographed, judged, and potentially catastrophic if you got it wrong. Let me walk you through a typical day, and I want you to pay attention to how much work this actually required. Because these women were not just sitting around being rich, they were performing a job that demanded constant vigilance, perfect execution, and enormous amounts of energy. Your day begins around 9 in the morning, but you do not just wake up and throw on whatever clothes are nearby. Oh no, you have a lady's maid who's already laid out your morning outfit, and I mean outfit. Plural items, multiple layers. First the undergarments. Corset, multiple petticoats, stockings, chemise. We're talking about at least 5 or 6 separate pieces of clothing before you even get to the actual dress. And the corset? That thing is laced so tight you can barely breathe. Because the fashionable silhouette of the 1890s required an impossibly tiny waist. 18 inches if possible. 20 inches if you were being generous. How do you eat breakfast in a corset laced to 18 inches? Very carefully. Over the undergarments goes your morning dress. Morning dresses were relatively simple compared to evening gowns, but they were still elaborate. High collars, long sleeves, multiple buttons, heavy fabric. And remember, this is summer. in Rhode Island, before air conditioning. You're essentially wrapped in layers of wool and cotton while the temperature climbs into the 80s. But you cannot look uncomfortable. That would be vulgar. You have to act as if wearing 40 pounds of clothing in summer heat is perfectly natural and pleasant. Around 10 in the morning, you might take a carriage ride. Not for exercise or transportation, for being seen. You have a specific carriage for morning rides, different from your afternoon carriage, different from your evening carriage, each one designed to showcase your wealth and taste. Mamie Fish was particularly known for her carriage collection. She had different carriages for different occasions, each one more elaborate than the last, and she chose them based on the impression she wanted to make that day. The morning carriage ride would take you along Bellevue Avenue where all the mansions were. You would wave to other society women in their carriages. You would be seen, you would see who else was out, you would gather gossip. This was social intelligence gathering disguised as a pleasant morning drive. Around 11, you might head to the casino. Now, when I say casino, I do not mean gambling. The Newport Casino was this exclusive club where the elite gathered. It had tennis courts, it had a theatre, it had a restaurant, it had beautifully landscaped grounds, but mostly it had other wealthy people. Tennis was huge in Newport, and the way women played tennis tells you everything about the absurdity of this world. They wore full-length skirts, white silk blouses, black stockings, sailor hats with attached double veils to protect their faces from the sun. Some sources say the skirts were pleated so that when they moved, they would flutter and occasionally reveal bloomers underneath, which was considered daring. Can you imagine playing tennis in that outfit? In summer, I can barely play tennis in shorts and a t-shirt. These women were doing it in basically full Victorian dress. But here is the thing. Most of the women at the casino were not actually playing tennis. They were watching tennis. They would sit under parasols, dressed to perfection, watching the games and socializing. Because the point was not exercise. The point was being seen at the right place with the right people. Tessie Earlrichs actually met her husband Herman at the casino during a tennis match. That is how central this place was to Newport's social life. You could meet your future spouse there, make important connections, hear the latest gossip, all while pretending to care about tennis. After the casino, you would return home to change for lunch, because you could not wear your morning outfit to lunch. That would be inappropriate. So another complete outfit change. Different dress, different accessories, different shoes, your lady's maid helping you out of one costume and into another. Lunch was usually a smaller affair, maybe just family or a few close friends, but even a casual lunch required proper dress and proper behaviour. There were rules about which fork to use for which course, rules about how to hold your teacup, rules about appropriate conversation topics. And speaking of topics, there were things you could not discuss. Business was vulgar. Politics was inappropriate for ladies. Money was never mentioned directly. You could talk about parties, fashion, gossip, perhaps art or theatre, but always in the proper way, always maintaining the fiction that your life was effortless and charming. After lunch came the most important social ritual of the day, calling hours. And this is where things get really complicated. Calling hours typically ran from 3 to 6 in the afternoon. During this time, society women would visit each other's homes. But this was not like dropping by a friend's house today. This was a highly structured social performance with incredibly specific rules. First, you had calling cards. These were small cards with your name printed on them. You always carried a supply of cards with you. If you visited someone and they were not home, you would leave your card. This indicated that you had made the effort to visit. The person receiving the card was then obligated to return the visit within a certain time frame. But there were rules about the cards themselves. A married woman's card had her husband's name on it. Mrs. William Astor. Not Caroline. Not her own first name. She was defined by her husband's identity. A single woman's card had her own name but also indicated her father's household. You would arrive at someone's home in your visiting outfit, another complete wardrobe change from lunch, naturally. You would be announced by the butler. You would enter the receiving room where the lady of the house would be waiting, and here is where it gets interesting. You did not actually have to stay long. In fact, staying too long was considered rude. A proper call lasted 15 to 20 minutes. That is it. You would sit, make polite conversation, admire something in the room, perhaps have tea, and then you would leave, making room for the next caller. Some of these women would make 10 or 12 calls in a single afternoon. Different houses, different warm-hearted hostesses, each visit requiring perfect performance, perfect manners, perfect awareness of social dynamics. Because during these calls you were gathering intelligence. Who was visiting whom? Who was not invited to which party? What was the gossip? Who was wearing what? Every detail mattered. Every interaction was meaningful. Tessie O'Ilrichs was known for being incredibly strict about calling hours. If you violated the rules, if you stayed too long or arrived at the wrong time or failed to return a call promptly, she would remember, and she would hold it against you. Around 6, you would return home exhausted from making calls, but you could not rest, because now you had to prepare for dinner, and dinner was the main event of the day. Dinner in Newport High society was an elaborate production. It typically started at 8 and could last for hours, and yes, you had to change clothes again. Evening dress, this was where you brought out the serious fashion. Evening gowns in the 1890s were extraordinary. Low-cut necklines, bare shoulders and arms, elaborate embroidery, sometimes with trains that stretched several feet behind you, expensive fabrics, silk, satin, velvet, and jewellery, so much jewellery. The women would compete to see who could wear the most diamonds, pearl necklaces, diamond tiaras, emerald bracelets, ruby brooches. You would walk into a dinner party and it would be like stepping into a jewellery store that happened to serve food. Dinner itself was a production, multiple courses, sometimes 10 or 12 courses. Each course served on different china with different silverware. You had to know which fork to use for which course, which glass was for which wine, how to pace yourself so you did not get full too early. And the food, absolutely ridiculous. Oysters, caviar, turtle soup, whole roasted birds, elaborate desserts, imported delicacies that cost more than most people made in a month. All of it designed to showcase the host's wealth and sophistication. But here is what I find fascinating. Despite all this food, the women could barely eat any of it. Remember that 18-inch corset? You cannot actually consume a 10-course meal when your internal organs are compressed into half their normal space. So the women would take tiny bites, move food around their plates, and try to look like they were enjoying themselves while secretly being unable to breathe. The men, of course, were not corseted, so they could eat as much as they wanted. Another small example of how different the rules were for men and women in this world. After dinner, there might be entertainment, music, perhaps someone would play piano, maybe there would be dancing, conversation would continue, men would retire to smoke cigars and drink brandy, women would gather in the drawing room to gossip, and you would finally return home around midnight, exhausted, starving because you could barely eat dinner, probably with a headache from the corset, your feet aching from uncomfortable shoes, but you could not just collapse into bed. First, your lady's maid would help you undress, unlace the corset, remove all the pins from your hair, help you into your nightgown. And while she did this, you would be thinking about tomorrow, what you would wear, which calls you needed to make, which parties you'd been invited to, because it all started again in the morning, day after day, week after week, the entire summer season. Now, I want to talk about the rules around fashion for a moment, because there were so many specific rules about what you could and could not wear and when. You needed different outfits for every occasion. Morning dress, carriage dress, visiting dress, tea dress, dinner dress, ball gown, each one distinct, each one appropriate only for its specific purpose. Some sources estimate that fashionable women would go through 80 to 90 different dresses in a single season, and many of these dresses were worn only once or twice. Imagine that. 80 dresses, each one custom-made, each one costing hundreds or thousands of dollars. Worn once to a party, maybe once more to a different event, and then never worn again because everyone had already seen it. The waste is staggering, but that was the point. Conspicuous consumption, showing that you had so much money you could afford to wear something once and discard it. Colours were important too. Certain colours were appropriate for certain times of day. Pastels for morning, richer colours for afternoon, dark, dramatic colours for evening. Black was always acceptable, but it also signalled mourning, so you had to be careful with context. And speaking of mourning, there were elaborate rules about that too. If a close family member died, you were expected to wear full mourning for a year. Black clothes, black veils, limited social activities. After the first year, you could transition to half mourning, which allowed some grey and purple, but you were expected to show your grief through your wardrobe for an extended period. White was complicated. Young unmarried women wore white to signal their purity and availability, but older women generally avoided it unless they were at a specific type of event, and you definitely could not wear white to someone else's wedding. Accessories were their own challenge. Gloves for every occasion, different gloves for morning, afternoon and evening. Hats were mandatory for outdoor activities. Parasols to protect skin from the sun, because tanned skin suggested you worked outdoors and were therefore lower class. And jewellery. The jewellery rules were extensive. Diamonds were for evening, pearls were more versatile, coloured stones had to be chosen carefully to complement your outfit, and you had to own enough jewellery to create variety without repeating the same pieces too often. Here is something interesting about beach fashion. Yes, wealthy people went to the beach, but beach attire was almost as elaborate as regular clothing. Women wore full-skirted bathing costumes with long black stockings. The outfits were made of heavy fabric that became even heavier when wet, and they were not really designed for actual swimming. They were designed for wading decorously in shallow water while looking fashionable. One account describes James Van Allen, a prominent Newport figure, going into the water wearing his monocle and a white straw hat because apparently you could not let your standards slip even while swimming. Alva Belmont reportedly carried a green umbrella into the water to protect herself from the sun. An umbrella. In the ocean. Just think about that image for a second. Now let me talk about etiquette books, because these were huge during this period. Women studied etiquette books like they were studying for the most important exam of their lives, because in a way they were. One popular book was called Decorum, a practical treatise on etiquette and dress of the best American society. It was published in 1877 and gave advice on absolutely everything. How to dress, how to speak, how to write letters, how to behave at parties, how to interact with servants. One particularly interesting piece of advice from that book was, never dress above your station. It is a grievous mistake and leads to great evils, besides being the proof of an utter want of taste. Think about that advice in context. These are books written for wealthy people, and even they were being told not to dress too far above their station. The implication being that even within the upper class there were gradations, and you needed to dress appropriately for your specific level of wealth and status. The anxiety around getting these details right must have been enormous, because one mistake could ruin your reputation. Wear the wrong thing to the wrong event. People would gossip about it for weeks. Use the wrong fork at dinner. You would be marked as poorly educated. Stay too long during calling hours. You would be considered rude and presumptuous. It was a constant performance every moment of every day, and the audience was always watching or was judging or was ready to criticize any misstep. I think modern people sometimes look at this world and think it must have been nice to be so wealthy and privileged. And yes, obviously, being rich is better than being poor. But this particular version of wealth came with its own kind of prison. These women were trapped in elaborate costumes, following Byzantine rules, performing social rituals that consumed their entire existence. They could not just be themselves. They could not dress comfortably. They could not speak freely. They could not even eat a full meal without physical discomfort. Everything was controlled. Everything was performative. Everything was about maintaining appearances and meeting expectations. And here is the really wild part. They chose this. Most of these women fought to be part of this world. They saw these constraints as privileges because being included in high society meant having power, status, and influence. It meant your children would have better opportunities. It meant you mattered in a way that money alone could not provide. But I wonder sometimes if they ever had moments of clarity. Moments where they looked at their 80 dresses or their 15 different pairs of gloves or their rigidly scheduled days and thought, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? Maybe some of them did. Maybe that is part of why women like Mamie Fish started breaking the rules and making high society more entertaining. Maybe that is why Alva Belmont eventually moved beyond social climbing and into political activism. Maybe they realized that this elaborate game, while powerful, was also kind of absurd. But the game continued. Day after day, season after season. The rituals of power performed by women in corsets and diamonds, all competing to prove they belonged in a world that demanded everything and promised nothing, except more of the same. Still, all those exhausting rituals, all those complicated rules, all that performance required people to orchestrate it, and not just the women who participated. Behind every great social queen was someone helping her navigate the system. Usually a man, often a man who could say things and do things that the women themselves could not. So let us talk about the men behind the curtain, the social architects, the court jesters, the men who made high society function while pretending they were not really in charge. Every powerful woman needs an advisor, someone who can say the things she cannot say, do the things she cannot do, play the roles she cannot play while maintaining her dignity and authority. In the world of Gilded Age high society, these advisors were almost always men, and they were often, though not always openly, gay men who occupied this fascinating space between the masculine world of business and the feminine world of social power. Let me introduce you to two of the most important men in this story. Men whose names you might not know, but whose influence shaped everything we have been talking about. First, Ward McAllister, the man who basically invented the concept of the 400. The social architect who helped Caroline Astor build her empire of exclusivity. Samuel Ward McAllister was born in Savannah, Georgia in 1827. His family was wealthy and well-connected. Old money. The kind of background that gave you automatic credibility in social circles. He studied law and even practiced for a while, but his real passion was always society, parties, etiquette, the elaborate social dance of who belonged where. In his 20s, Ward moved to San Francisco during the gold rush era, and this is where he started developing his philosophy about society. He saw all these newly rich miners and entrepreneurs throwing money around, trying to buy their way into respectability, and he was absolutely horrified by it. He thought they were vulgar and crude. He believed that real society required breeding, education, and proper behavior, not just wealth. He married Sarah Gibbons, who came from a prominent family, and they moved to New York in the 1852, and this is when Ward really found his calling. He positioned himself as an expert on society, a tastemaker, someone who could teach the merely wealthy how to become truly fashionable. Ward was distantly related to the Astors through his wife's family, and somehow he managed to become Caroline Astor's closest confidant, her social secretary, essentially, the man who helped her organize parties, curate guest lists, and enforce her vision of what high society should be. Now here is what I find fascinating about Ward. He was completely obsessed with the European aristocracy. He wanted American society to be just like the courts of Europe. All the formality, all the ritual, all the exclusivity. He genuinely believed that America needed an aristocratic class, even though that went against the entire founding principle of the country. He spent a lot of time in Europe studying how things were done there. He would come back to New York with ideas about how to make American society more refined, more exclusive, more European. And Caroline loved it because it gave her system intellectual legitimacy. It was not just arbitrary snobbery, it was following the models of the great European courts. In 1888, Ward gave that famous interview to the New York Tribune where he coined the phrase the 400. He said there were only 400 people in New York who really mattered. 400 people who felt at ease in a ballroom and made others feel at ease. The newspapers loved it. It was such a quotable, controversial statement. And it made Ward incredibly famous. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know who was on this list. Who were the 400? What made them special? How could you become one of them? Ward loved the attention. He started giving more interviews, talking about society, offering his opinions on who was acceptable and who was not. He became a celebrity in his own right, not because he was particularly wealthy or accomplished, but because he appointed himself the arbiter of taste. But here is where things got complicated for Ward. In 1890, he published a memoir called Society as I Have Found It. And in this book, he told stories about high society, about the parties, about the wealthy families, about the social dynamics and the gossip. The problem? The old guard families were absolutely furious because they valued their privacy. They did not want their social world exposed to public scrutiny. They thought Ward had betrayed them by writing this book, by turning their private world into entertainment for the masses. And then in 1892, Ward made an even bigger mistake. He actually published the list, the official 400, names and everything, in the New York Times on February 16, 1892. The backlash was immediate and brutal. The newspapers started mocking him, calling him Mr. Make-a-Lister. Some of the families who were left off the list were angry. Some of the families who were on the list were embarrassed to be publicly named. And the old guard families thought the whole thing was tacky and vulgar. Ward had violated a fundamental rule. You could have exclusivity, but you could not talk about it openly. You could not make it too obvious. You had to maintain the fiction that it was all natural and inevitable, not carefully constructed and ruthlessly enforced. Caroline Astor was reportedly not pleased. She had used Ward to build her system, but now he'd become a liability. He had made the invisible mechanisms of power too visible, and that undermined the whole thing. Ward spent his last years somewhat ostracized from the society he had helped create. He died in 1895, largely forgotten by the people he had served. His funeral was small. Few of the society figures he had worked with attended. It was a sad ending for someone who had been so central to their world. But here is the lesson in Ward's story. He understood something important about power. He knew that exclusivity required structure. It required rules and definitions and boundaries. You could not just have a vague sense of who belonged. You needed systems, lists, criteria. He gave Caroline Astor the tools to formalize her power, but he also learned the hard way that being the person who makes the rules visible is dangerous. The powerful want their power to seem natural, inevitable. When you expose the machinery, when you show how arbitrary and constructed it all is, you threaten the whole system. Now let me tell you about Harry Lehr, because Harry was Ward's successor in many ways, but he played the game very differently. Harry Lehr was born in 1869 in Baltimore. His family had some money, but nothing spectacular. Certainly not 400-level wealth. But Harry had something more valuable than money. He had personality, charm, wit, and an absolute genius for entertaining wealthy people. Harry moved to Newport in his 20s and quickly made a name for himself as the most amusing person at any party. He could tell jokes, do impressions, plan elaborate entertainments. He was funny, irreverent, and completely unthreatening to the women who ran high society. Unlike Ward McAllister, who took society deadly seriously, Harry treated it like a game, a performance, something to be enjoyed rather than worshipped. And the Triumvirate loved him for it. Mamie Fish especially. She made Harry her court jester, essentially. He would help her plan her outrageous parties, come up with entertainment ideas, keep everyone laughing. Harry called himself a professional guest. That was actually his job description, being entertaining at parties. And wealthy women would literally pay him to attend their events because his presence guaranteed that people would have a good time. Think about that for a second. Harry Lair's career was showing up to parties and being charming. That was it. That was how he made his living. And he was good enough at it that he lived quite comfortably. But Harry had a secret. And this is where the story gets both sad and fascinating. Harry was almost certainly gay in an era when being openly gay was not just socially unacceptable but literally illegal. So Harry had to hide this fundamental part of who he was. And he did it by marrying a wealthy woman named Elizabeth Drexel. Elizabeth came from the Drexel banking family, serious money, and she was a bit older than Harry, in her 30s when they married. There are different accounts of why she married him. Some sources say Harry was honest with her about his sexuality, and they had an understanding. Other sources suggest he deceived her, and she only found out after the wedding. Either way, the marriage was apparently miserable. They lived together but barely spoke. Elizabeth later wrote that their honeymoon was a nightmare, that Harry was cruel to her, that she felt trapped in a loveless marriage with a man who clearly did not want to be with her. But publicly they maintained the fiction of a proper society marriage, because that's what you did. You kept up appearances. You performed the role expected of you, even if it made you miserable. Harry continued being the darling of Newport society. He organised parties for Mamie Fish. He entertained the Triumvirate. He made wealthy women laugh. And he probably spent time with male companions discreetly in ways that society chose not to notice as long as he was careful. Because here is something interesting about Gilded Age high society. There were quite a few men like Harry Lair, men who were accepted in women's social circles precisely because they were not interested in women romantically. They were safe. They could be close friends with married women without causing scandal. They could give advice about fashion and parties without any sexual tension complicating things. These men occupied a unique space, too refined for the masculine world of business and clubs, too useful to exclude from the feminine world of social power. As long as they were discreet, as long as they played their roles properly, they could have successful social careers. But the price was high. Living in the closet, marrying women they did not love, performing straightness every single day, never being able to be fully authentic, that must have been exhausting and soul-crushing. Harry gave advice that reveals his insider-outsider status. He once said, "Avoid Newport like the plague until you are certain that you will be acceptable there." He understood that Newport could destroy you if you did not belong. He had seen it happen, and he was warning people to be careful. He also understood the dynamics of the Triumvirate better than almost anyone. He saw how Mamie, Tessie, and Alva worked together, how they balanced each other, how they maintained power through different strategies. Mamie needed Harry because he made her parties legendary. He came up with the crazy ideas, the monkey prints, the elephant, the elaborate themes. He understood that she wanted to be seen as the fun one, and he helped her achieve that image. Tessie tolerated Harry because he was useful and knew his place. She might have been the strict one, but even she appreciated good entertainment, and Harry knew when to be outrageous and when to be respectful. Alva probably saw through Harry more than the others. She was sharp, perceptive, and she had her own experience being an outsider who had to fight her way in. She might have understood what Harry was really doing, playing a role to survive. There is a story about a dinner party hosted by Pembroke Jones, who was known for extravagant Southern-style dinners. Harry helped plan the menu and entertainment. He understood that these events were not just about food, they were about creating experiences people would remember and talk about. The social season in Newport required constant entertainment, constant novelty. You could not just throw the same party over and over. You needed fresh ideas, new themes, surprising elements, and Harry was a genius at providing that. But I think about Harry sometimes and wonder what he really thought about all of it. Did he enjoy his role? Or did he feel like he was constantly performing, never able to be himself? Did he resent the women he entertained? Or did he appreciate that they gave him a place in a world that otherwise might have rejected him? We know he had a sharp tongue. He could be cutting and cruel when he wanted to be. Maybe that was his way of expressing anger he could not otherwise show. Maybe it was his defense mechanism. Or maybe he was just genuinely mean sometimes. People are complicated. Harry died in 1929. By then, the world had changed enormously. The Roaring Twenties were in full swing. Society was much more relaxed. The old rigid structures were breaking down. But Harry had spent his entire adult life in the previous era. He was a product of that world. And when that world ended, his role ended too. Looking at Ward McAllister and Harry Lair together, you see two different approaches to the same basic challenge. How do you gain access to power when you're not actually powerful yourself? Ward tried to become indispensable by being the expert, the architect, the one who understood the rules better than anyone. He succeeded for a while, but ultimately he got too close to the sun. He revealed too much. He made the mistake of thinking his role gave him actual power rather than just access to power. Harry took a different approach. He stayed in his lane. He was the entertainer, the amusing companion, never threatening, never trying to be more than what he was. And because of that, he lasted longer. He maintained his position until the whole system collapsed. Both men were using their positions to survive in a world that did not quite have a place for them. Both were outsiders who found ways to become insiders, and both paid a price for it. Their stories raise interesting questions about gender and power in this era. The women had social power but limited legal and financial power. They could ruin reputations but could not vote or own property in their own names easily. The men had legal and financial power but needed the women's social acceptance to fully enjoy their wealth. And then there were men like Ward and Harry, who had neither economic power nor social power by birth. They had to create roles for themselves. They had to make themselves useful to the people who did have power. It was a fascinating dance of different kinds of privilege and lack thereof intersecting. I think in some ways Ward and Harry were more modern than the women they served. They understood that identity could be performed, that social roles were constructed, that you could create a persona and inhabit it so fully that it became real. They were early masters of personal branding essentially, but the cost of that performance, especially for Harry, were never being able to fully be himself, always calculating, always aware of how he was being perceived, always walking the line between entertaining and threatening. Do you think they enjoyed their lives, or do you think they felt trapped by the roles they'd created for themselves? It is a question I genuinely do not know the answer to. What I do know is that their influence was enormous. Without Ward McAllister, Carol and Astor might never have created the 400. Without Harry Lair, the Triumvirate might have been much less entertaining and therefore much less successful at maintaining power in a changing world. These men shaped high society as much as any of the women did. They just did it from the shadows, from behind the curtain, using different tools and playing different roles. And speaking of roles and performances, we need to talk about the most spectacular social performances of this entire era. The costume balls, the elaborate parties, the events that cost fortunes and created legends, because these were not just parties, they were carefully planned invasions, strategic battles fought with diamonds and champagne instead of armies. Let us talk about the most famous social coups in history. There is a moment in warfare when everything hangs in the balance. When months of planning, strategy, and preparation come down to a single decisive action. In the world of Gilded Age high society, those moments did not happen on battlefields. They happened in ballrooms, with orchestras instead of armies, with diamonds instead of weapons, and with consequences that could reshape the entire social landscape. We already talked about Alva Vanderbilt's legendary 1883 ball, the one that forced Mrs. Astor to acknowledge the Vanderbilts. But that was just the beginning. Because once Alva proved that a perfectly executed party could change everything, other women started using the same strategy. The costume ball became the ultimate weapon in social warfare. Let me take you deeper into that 1883 Vanderbilt ball, because the details are absolutely wild and they show you just how much thought and strategy went into these events. Alva spent months planning. She hired the best of everything. The decorations alone cost a fortune. The house was transformed into different themed rooms. One room was decorated like a tropical garden, with palm trees and exotic flowers imported from God knows where. Another room was done up like a European castle with tapestries and armour. She hired multiple orchestras, not just one, multiple, so that music would be playing in every room, different styles for different moods. Waltzes in the main ballroom, more upbeat music in the dining area, soft background music in the conversation rooms. The supper was prepared by the most expensive caterers in New York. We are talking about hundreds of dishes, everything from oysters on ice to elaborate French pastries, champagne flowing constantly, wines from the best vineyards in Europe. The food and drink alone probably cost more than most families earned in several years. But the real genius was in the guest list. Alva invited 1,200 people, that is 3 times the size of the 400. She was making a statement. She was saying, your exclusive list? I am bigger than that. I can fill a ballroom with more people than you even acknowledge exist. And the costumes. Oh, the costumes. People spent months working with designers, importing fabrics from Europe, commissioning jewellery specifically for their outfits. These were not Halloween costumes you could throw together in an afternoon. These were works of art that cost thousands of dollars each. Alva herself wore that Venetian princess costume we mentioned, white and gold brocade, a train so long it required assistants to manage, ropes of pearls, diamonds everywhere. But the symbolism was important. A Venetian princess. Venice was known for its merchant princes, new money that became old money, new wealth that built an empire. Alva was signalling exactly what she intended to do. Her sister-in-law, Alice Claypool Vanderbilt, came as electric light. Her costume was covered in actual working light bulbs. This was 1883. Electric lighting was brand new technology. Most homes still used gas lamps. So Alice was literally wearing the future. She was saying, we are not just rich, we are modern, we are progress, we are what comes next. Think about that symbolism for a second. Old money represented tradition and the past. New money represented innovation and the future. And Alice Vanderbilt showed up to the party dressed as electricity itself. That is next-level strategic costume choice. Another guest, Charlotte Augusta Astor Haig, who was actually related to the Astor family, came dressed elaborately. Even members of the old guard families could not resist attending. Because as much as they wanted to maintain their exclusivity, they also could not stand missing what was clearly going to be the event of the decade. The party started at 10 at night and went until dawn. 6 hours of dancing, eating, drinking and socializing, and every single moment was documented. Jose Maria Mora, the photographer Alva hired, took hundreds of photographs. This was unusual because photography was still relatively new and expensive, but Alva wanted proof. She wanted evidence that all these important people had attended her party. And it worked. The next day, every newspaper in New York wrote about it. The social columns, the gossip pages, even the regular news sections covered it. They described the costumes in detail. They listed the important guests who attended. They estimated the cost at $250,000, which is about $7.5 million today. For one party, one night, $7.5 million. But Alva got what she paid for: instant legitimacy, acceptance into the highest levels of society, and a reputation as someone who could throw a party unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Other women took notes. In 1897, the Bradley Martin Ball happened, and this one caused an actual scandal, not because it was offensive or inappropriate by society standards, but because it was too much, too extravagant, too tone-deaf to the economic struggles ordinary people were facing. The Martins were a wealthy family, but they wanted to cement their position in society, so they decided to throw the most expensive ball anyone had ever seen. They rented the ballroom at the Waldorf Hotel. They spent $370,000 on the party. That is over $12 million in today's money. The theme was the court of Versailles. Guests were required to dress as French royalty or nobility, and they went all out. One woman wore a dress that allegedly cost $10,000, just the dress, not counting jewelry or accessories. Another woman wore so many diamonds and other jewels that she reportedly needed a private security guard just to protect her costume. The problem? 1897 was a depression year. The economy was struggling. People were out of work. There was real poverty and suffering. And here were the wealthiest families in America spending millions on a costume party. The newspapers, which had previously loved reporting on high society parties, turned critical. They called it obscene, wasteful, tone-deaf. The Bradley Martins were criticized so harshly that they eventually left New York permanently and moved to England. One party literally drove them out of the country. That is how powerful public opinion could be. Even the super wealthy were not immune to backlash when they pushed too far. But the most strategic party, the one that shows the most sophisticated understanding of social warfare, might be the one Tessie Earl Ritchie's threw in 1904. Tessie had just finished building Rosecliff, her palace in Newport, $2.5 million, modelled after Versailles, the most beautiful summer house anyone had ever seen. And she needed a housewarming party that would establish her as a serious power player. So she threw what she called the White Ball. Everything had to be white. White decorations, white flowers. Guests wore white. Even the food was white. It was visually stunning. Absolutely gorgeous. And it became famous not just for its beauty, but for what it represented. White was purity, perfection, blank slate. Tessie was saying, I'm starting fresh. I'm creating something new and beautiful and perfect. And by requiring everyone to wear white, she was making them part of her vision, part of her aesthetic. They were not just guests. They were participants in her creation. The symbolism was brilliant. And it worked. The White Ball became legendary. People talked about it for years. And Tessie secured her position as one of the Triumvirate. But here is something interesting. These parties were not just about showing off wealth. They were about demonstrating specific skills. Planning, organization, creativity, attention to detail, the ability to manage large events flawlessly. Think about what it took to execute one of these balls. You had to coordinate with multiple vendors. Caterers, decorators, musicians, photographers, security. You had to manage guest lists, send invitations, track responses, handle logistics, deal with last-minute changes, manage personalities and egos. These women were essentially running major events. If they had been born 50 years later, they would have been event planners or party promoters or marketing executives. They had real skills. They just had to deploy those skills in the only arena available to them. Social competition. And the stakes were real. A successful party could elevate your status for years. A failed party could destroy your reputation. If people left early, disaster. If the food was not good enough, people would talk about it for months. If you made a mistake with the guest list and invited the wrong person or excluded someone important, social suicide. So these women planned obsessively. They stressed over every detail. They lost sleep worrying about whether everything would go perfectly. Because unlike a bad business deal which you could recover from, a social failure was permanent. You could not try again next week. The social season was finite. If you failed during your moment, that was it. Let me tell you about another famous party. The servants' ball that Mamie Fish threw. This was Mamie being Mamie, taking the whole thing and turning it on its head. The concept was simple but brilliant. She invited all her wealthy society friends, but she asked them to come dressed as servants, maids, butlers, cooks, chauffeurs, the very people who usually served them. And who did she hire to serve the food and drinks? Actual wealthy people from slightly less prominent families who were desperate for social advancement. They would dress up in formal evening wear and serve the costumed servants, who were actually the richest people in Newport. It was social satire, it was commentary on class and privilege, and it was hilarious. People loved it because it was so unexpected, so irreverent, so perfectly Mamie. But here is the genius part. By making fun of the whole system, Mamie actually reinforced it, because you can only make fun of something when you are securely inside it. The party was saying, look how ridiculous this all is. We can afford to laugh about it. Because we are so powerful that nothing can touch us. That is advanced social maneuvering, using humour and irony to demonstrate confidence and security. Now let me tell you about one of the most strategic social coups that did not involve a party at all. The marriage of Tessie Ulrich's sister Birdie to William K. Vanderbilt Jr. This happened in 1899. Birdie Fair was Tessie's younger sister. She came from that same Western mining fortune. Nouveau riche, Western. Everything the old guard looked down on, but she was young and beautiful and had a huge dowry. William K. Vanderbilt Jr. was Alva's son. He was one of the most eligible bachelors in America, heir to the Vanderbilt fortune. Handsome, well-connected, and most importantly, he had the Vanderbilt name, which by 1899 had become acceptable in the highest circles. The marriage was orchestrated by Tessie and Alva working together, and it was brilliant strategy for both of them. Tessie got her sister married into the most prominent new money family in America. Alva got a massive injection of Western mining money into the Vanderbilt coffers through Birdie's dowry. But more importantly, it cemented the alliance between these two women. They were now family, sisters-in-law through their siblings. That made their partnership in the Triumvirate even stronger. It was not just social alliance, it was blood alliance. The wedding was covered extensively in the society pages. Everyone talked about how beautiful it was, how elegant, how perfectly it brought together Eastern and Western wealth. It was spun as a romantic love story, but really it was a strategic merger, like a corporate acquisition, but with white dresses and champagne. And that was how the game was played at the highest levels. Not just through parties, though parties were important, but through marriages, alliances, strategic partnerships. These women were playing three-dimensional chess while everyone else was playing checkers. Here is something I find fascinating. If you look at the most successful social coups, they all have certain things in common. First, they involved massive expenditure. You could not win by being frugal. You had to demonstrate that you were willing to spend whatever it took. That you had so much money that a few $1 million on a party was nothing to you. Second, they required perfect execution. Everything had to be flawless. The decorations, the food, the music, the guest list. One mistake could ruin the whole thing, so you needed incredible organizational skills and attention to detail. Third, they needed to tell a story. The best parties were not just expensive, they had themes that communicated something about the host. Alva's Venetian princess costume, Alice's electric light outfit, Tessie's white ball. These were not random choices. They were carefully constructed narratives about power and progress and perfection. Fourth, they required timing. You had to strike when the moment was right, when society was ready for something new, when the old guard was vulnerable, when public attention was focused. Bad timing could make even a perfect party fall flat. And fifth, they needed publicity. It was not enough to throw an amazing party. You had to make sure everyone knew about it. You needed newspapers covering it, photographers documenting it, guests talking about it for months afterward. The party itself was only half the battle. The PR campaign was the other half. These women understood modern marketing before marketing was even really a concept. They knew how to create buzz, how to manage public perception, how to turn an event into a legend. Now, there is a dark side to all of this that we need to acknowledge. The people who were excluded from these parties, the families who tried to break in and failed, the social casualties of this warfare. For every Alva Vanderbilt who successfully forced her way into society, there were dozens of families who tried and failed, who spent fortunes on parties that nobody remembered, who made social mistakes that destroyed them, who were excluded and had no idea why. The cruelty of this system was that the rules were never quite clear. Yes, you needed money, but how much? Yes, you needed breeding, but what kind? Yes, you needed to follow etiquette, but which etiquette exactly? The rules shifted depending on who was judging you. What worked for one person failed for another, and the women enforcing these rules, the Triumvirate and their allies, they could be vicious. They would gossip about people who failed, mock them behind their backs, exclude them systematically, destroy reputations with a few well-placed words. It was psychological warfare, and the weapons were words and invitations and pointed silences. You could be destroyed and never really know why, never get a second chance, never recover. That is the part of this story that is hard to romanticize. Yes, these women were brilliant strategists. Yes, they wielded real power, but they also used that power to hurt people, to maintain artificial hierarchies, to protect their own positions at the expense of others. So when we talk about these famous balls and social coups, we need to remember that they were not just glamorous parties. They were battles in a war that had real casualties. People who invested their fortunes and their hopes into breaking into society, only to be rejected and humiliated. But here is the question that keeps coming back to me. What were these women really fighting for? Social position, obviously, status and power. But why? Why did it matter so much? I think part of it was because social power was one of the only forms of power available to wealthy women. They could not vote. They could not own businesses easily. They could not pursue careers. So they poured all their ambition and intelligence and energy into the one arena where they could compete and win. These parties were not just parties, they were the Olympics of feminine achievement in that era. The World Series of Women's Ambition, the battlefield where they proved themselves. And when you look at it that way, it is both impressive and tragic. Impressive that they found ways to exercise power and influence. Tragic that this was the only avenue available to them. As we move forward, we are going to start seeing the cracks in this system, the ways it failed people, the costs it extracted, the darkness behind the diamonds, because every empire, even a social empire, has its shadows, and the Gilded Age was no exception. But before we go into the darkness, I want to show you something important. Something that gets forgotten in all the talk about balls and parties and social warfare. Behind every glittering facade, behind every perfect party, behind every strategic victory, there were real human beings, with real pain, real loneliness, real desperation. The next chapter of our story is about the cost, the price these women paid for their power and position, the sadness hiding behind the smiles. Behind every diamond tiara was a woman who could not take it off. Behind every perfect smile was a scream that could never be heard. Behind every glittering ballroom was a bedroom where two people slept as strangers. This is the part of the story they did not put in the society pages, the part that happened after the photographers left. After the guests went home, after the servants cleaned up the champagne glasses and the orchestra packed away their instruments, this is the part about what it actually cost to be a queen. Let me start with the most heartbreaking story, Consuelo Vanderbilt. Consuelo was born in 1877. She was Alva's daughter. We have talked about Alva as this powerful, strategic woman who forced her way into society. But what we have not talked about is what Alva did to her own child in pursuit of that power. From the time Consuelo was a little girl, Alva had plans for her. Not hopes, not dreams, plans. Consuelo was going to marry into European aristocracy, specifically British aristocracy, because that was the ultimate prize. American money could buy a lot of things, but it could not buy a title unless you married one. Consuelo grew up beautiful, absolutely stunning, tall, elegant, perfect posture, perfect manners, everything a society girl should be. But she was also sensitive, artistic. She liked to read, she liked to paint. She was not particularly interested in the social games her mother played, and when she was a teenager, she fell in love with a young American man named Winthrop Rutherford. He was handsome, charming, from a good family, and most importantly, Consuelo actually loved him. They wanted to get married, they made plans, they dreamed about their future together. Alva said no, absolutely not. Her daughter was not going to marry some nobody American, even if he came from a respectable family. Consuelo was going to marry a duke, specifically Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. Now, the Duke was not a bad person necessarily. He was educated, well-mannered, acceptable by all objective measures, but there were two problems. First, Consuelo did not love him at all. Second, he did not love her. He needed money. The Marlborough estates were expensive to maintain. British aristocracy in the 1890s was land-rich but cash-poor. They had titles and castles, but not enough income to maintain them. So this was a transaction. American money for a British title. The Duke got millions of dollars. Alva got a duchess for a daughter. And Consuelo got a lifetime of misery. The pressure Alva put on her daughter was enormous. When Consuelo protested when she said she loved someone else, Alva allegedly became physically ill. She took to her bed, made it seem like Consuelo's resistance was literally killing her mother. Classic manipulation. Consuelo tried to resist. She wrote letters to Winthrop. She begged her father to intervene. But Willie K. Vanderbilt was in no position to help. He was in the middle of divorcing Alva. He had his own problems. He could not save his daughter even if he wanted to. Finally, Consuelo gave up. On November 6, 1895, when she was just 18 years old, she married the Duke of Marlborough. The wedding was huge, elaborate. Everyone who mattered in New York society attended. It was covered extensively in the newspapers. The perfect fairy tale, American princess marries British duke. Except Consuelo cried through the entire ceremony. Not happy tears, tears of despair. She later wrote in her autobiography that she felt like she was attending her own funeral. She described herself as a victim being led to sacrifice. Can you imagine? 18 years old, walking down the aisle in a wedding dress that cost thousands of dollars, surrounded by flowers and music and guests, and feeling like you were dying inside. The marriage was exactly as unhappy as you would expect. The Duke was cold, distant. He had married her for money and made no pretense otherwise. They had 2 children together because that was expected. An heir and a spare, as the British aristocracy called it. But there was no affection, no warmth, no companionship. Consuelo spent years trapped in British castles, maintaining massive estates, hosting parties for people she barely knew, and sleeping in a separate bedroom from a husband who barely spoke to her. She did her due, she played her role, but she was profoundly, desperately unhappy. Years later, after both she and the Duke had had enough, they separated, eventually divorced in 1921. And you know what Consuelo did after her divorce? She married for love. She married Jacques Balsan, a French pilot and adventurer. Someone she actually chose, someone who made her happy. She lived until 1964, died at age 87, which means she spent most of her adult life free from that horrible first marriage. But those early years, those years when she should have been young and happy, those were stolen from her by her mother's ambition. Alva Vanderbilt achieved everything she set out to achieve. She broke into society. She became one of the Triumvirate. She got her daughter married to a duke. But the cost was her relationship with Consuelo and her daughter's happiness. Was it worth it? I do not know. Alva probably thought so. She probably believed she was giving her daughter a better life. Access to aristocracy, a title, position in European society. But Consuelo paid the price. And Consuelo was not the only one. This kind of forced marriage happened constantly in this world. Daughters were traded like assets. Their feelings did not matter. Their preferences did not matter. What mattered was strategic alliance, social advancement, the family's position. Let me tell you about Tessie Ulrich's marriage. We talked about Tessie as one of the Triumvirate. Powerful, strategic, the drill sergeant in diamonds. But her marriage to Hermann Ulrichs was loveless from almost the beginning. They married in 1890 when Tessie was 19, and for the first few years things were probably okay. They had a son together in 1891, Hermann Ulrichs Jr., but over time the marriage deteriorated. They grew apart, stopped communicating, started living essentially separate lives under the same roof. Publicly they maintained appearances. They attended parties together, posed for photographs, did everything expected of a proper society couple. But privately they were strangers, sometimes worse than strangers. There are accounts of them being actively hostile to each other. When the massive San Francisco earthquake happened in 1906, Hermann was in California on business. Tessie heard the news and apparently feared he had died. And according to some sources, when she found out he survived, she hoped it might be a chance to reconcile, a near-death experience that would bring them back together. She prepared this elaborate dinner, a private, intimate meal for just the two of them, a chance to reconnect. She waited. He never showed up, just did not come, deliberately avoided the dinner she had planned. Can you imagine how that must have felt? Your husband survives a disaster. You think maybe this is a sign. Maybe you can fix what is broken, and he does not even care enough to show up. A few years later, Hermann died suddenly of a heart attack. He was only 53 years old, and here is the cruel part. His will left most of his fortune to his brother instead of to Tessie. Because they'd been estranged for so long, because their marriage was so clearly unhappy, he apparently did not want her to have his money. Tessie had to contest the will in court, fight for what she believed she was owed. Eventually she got half of his estate, but the whole thing was public and humiliating. Everyone knew her marriage had been a failure. Everyone knew her husband had tried to cut her out of his will. And this is someone who was supposed to be at the top of society, one of the most powerful women in Newport, living in a palace, wearing diamonds, throwing legendary parties, but sleeping alone in a huge mansion, married to a man who would not even have dinner with her. What about Caroline Astor herself, the Queen of Queens, the woman who ruled society for 40 years? What was her marriage like? William Backhouse Astor Jr. had zero interest in his wife's social activities. He spent as much time as possible on his yacht, sailing away from New York, away from the parties, away from the social season, away from Caroline. Some historians think William was simply not interested in society, that he found it all boring and preferred the freedom of the sea. Other historians suggest there might have been more to it, that maybe he had relationships or interests that he preferred to keep private, that the yacht was where he could be himself without social scrutiny. Either way, Caroline spent decades essentially functioning as a single woman while technically married. William provided money and the Astor name, but he did not provide companionship, partnership, love. And here is what breaks my heart about Caroline's story. In her last years, when she was suffering from dementia, when she had fallen down the stairs and hurt herself, when she was confused and frightened and vulnerable, William was not there. He had already died in 1892. She spent her final years without a partner, just servants and family members who had to watch this once powerful woman fade into confusion. Her daughter, Helen Roosevelt Astor, died young, at 34 years old, from what was ruled an accidental overdose of laudanum. Laudanum was an opium-based medicine that was completely legal and commonly used at the time, but overdoses were not uncommon, especially among unhappy women who used it to cope with depression or anxiety. Was Helen's death really an accident, or was it something darker? We will never know. But what we do know is that Caroline lost her daughter in 1893 and had to grieve while maintaining her role as society's queen. She could not fall apart publicly, could not show weakness, had to keep hosting parties and maintaining standards even while her heart was breaking. That is the cost of being the queen. You cannot be human. You cannot show vulnerability. You have to maintain the facade no matter what. And these were not isolated cases. Loveless marriages were the norm in high society, because marriages were not about love, they were about alliance, strategy, combining fortunes, producing heirs. Love was considered a bonus if it happened, but it was not the goal. Think about the logic. If you married for love, you might marry someone inappropriate, someone without money or connections, someone who would lower your social position. But if you married strategically, you could improve your family's standing, strengthen alliances, increase wealth. So parents arranged marriages, or if not explicitly arranged, they strongly guided their children toward appropriate matches and away from unsuitable ones. Love was dangerous because it made you unpredictable. It made you choose with your heart instead of your head. The result? A whole generation of women trapped in marriages they never wanted, living with men they did not love, producing children out of obligation rather than desire, spending their lives performing happiness while feeling empty inside, and they could not escape. Divorce was scandalous. It ruined your reputation. It could destroy your social position. Yes, Alva Vanderbilt got away with it, but that was exceptional. Most women did not have Alva's wealth or power or sheer force of personality. Most women who tried to divorce found themselves ostracized, cut off, financially ruined. So they stayed. They endured. They found ways to cope. Some had affairs, discreetly. Some threw themselves into social activities to avoid thinking about their unhappy homes. Some turned to alcohol or laudanum or other substances to numb the pain. Some just existed in quiet desperation, going through the motions of life without ever really living. The men were not necessarily happy either, to be fair. They were trapped too in different ways, expected to marry appropriate women whether they loved them or not, expected to produce heirs, expected to maintain the family name and fortune. But men had options women did not. They could pursue business interests. They could travel freely. They could have affairs without ruining their reputations. They could escape into clubs and exclusive male spaces. Women had no equivalent escape. Their entire lives were defined by their marriages and their social positions. If both of those were unhappy, they had nowhere to go, nothing else to be. And here is something that makes this even more tragic. These women were some of the most privileged people in America. They had wealth, they had beautiful homes, they had servants to handle every need. They had access to the finest things money could buy. But they did not have freedom. They did not have choice. They did not have the ability to shape their own lives. It is a reminder that money cannot buy happiness. That privilege does not equal fulfillment. That you can have everything society says you should want and still be profoundly miserable. I think about these women sometimes and wonder what they would have done if they had been born in a different era. If they had had the freedom to choose their own paths, would Consuelo have become an artist? Would Tessie have become a businesswoman? Would Caroline have pursued something beyond social control? We will never know, because they were born into a time and a system that gave them only one option: marriage, society, performance. And for many of them, that option brought more pain than joy. There is this photograph of Consuelo Vanderbilt on her wedding day. She is wearing this incredibly elaborate dress, covered in lace and pearls. The train is so long it fills half the room. She looks like a princess from a storybook. But if you look closely at her face, you can see the sadness in her eyes. You can see that this is not a happy bride. This is someone going through the motions of a ceremony that feels like a funeral. That photograph haunts me, because it captures something essential about this entire world. The gap between appearance and reality. The way people could look perfect while feeling broken. The way wealth and beauty and privilege could coexist with profound unhappiness. And it raises a question that I think is worth asking. Would you trade places with these women? Would you accept a lifetime of luxury and social power in exchange for giving up the freedom to choose who you love? To choose how you live? To choose who you get to be? Some people might say yes. Security and wealth are valuable things, but I think most of us, if we are honest, would say no. Because freedom, even uncertain freedom, is worth more than a golden cage. The tragedy of the Gilded Age is that these women did not get to make that choice. They were born into cages, beautiful, expensive, glittering cages, but cages nonetheless. Now all of this darkness, all this unhappiness, all these loveless marriages and broken hearts, they happened during what people called the Gilded Age. And that name is perfect, because something that is gilded looks like gold on the surface. But underneath it is just base metal, cheap, hollow, not real. The Gilded Age looked golden, mansions, parties, diamonds, glamour. But underneath all that shine was something darker. Inequality, cruelty, suffering. Both for the poor people who were excluded entirely and for the rich people who were trapped inside the system. And as we move into the early 1900s, that system was starting to crack. The world was changing. New ideas about women's rights, new attitudes about marriage and divorce, new social movements challenging the old hierarchies. And some of the women we have been talking about, they were about to become part of that change. But that is a story for the next part of our journey, because we need to talk about what happened when these social queens started to decline, when their power faded, when the world moved on without them. Every empire falls, every dynasty ends, every system that seems permanent eventually crumbles. And the empire of the Gilded Age social queens was no exception. The end did not come all at once. It was not dramatic like a battle or a revolution. Instead, it was gradual, a slow erosion of power, a quiet shifting of the ground beneath their feet. Until one day they looked around and realized the world had changed, and they had not changed with it. Let me take you through the forces that brought down the system Caroline Astor built, the pressures that made the Triumvirate's power increasingly irrelevant, the changes that transformed American society so fundamentally that the old rules simply stopped working. The first crack appeared in 1908, not coincidentally the year Caroline Astor died. With her death, something shifted. She had been the anchor, the fixed point around which everything else revolved. Even people who disagreed with her, who challenged her, who resented her power, they still had to acknowledge her. She was the reference point. But once she was gone, that centre disappeared. The Triumvirate stepped in, yes, Alva Belmont, Mamie Fish, and Tessie Ulrichs, but they were different. They represented a different approach, less rigid, more flexible, more willing to bend the rules. And that flexibility, while it made them successful for a time, also undermined the entire system. Because if the rules could bend, if exceptions could be made, If the barriers were not absolute, then what was the point? What were people fighting so hard to achieve? The mystique started to fade. The exclusivity that had made the 400 so powerful started to seem arbitrary, pointless, a game that was not worth playing. But that was just the beginning. Much bigger forces were at work. The second major pressure was economic. In 1913, something happened that would change everything for the super wealthy. The federal income tax was established. Before 1913, there was no income tax. The wealthy could accumulate money without the government taking a significant portion. But after the 16th Amendment was ratified, suddenly the richest Americans had to pay taxes on their income. Real taxes, substantial amounts. At first, the rates were low, just 7% at the top bracket. But the precedent was set. The government could tax income, and over time those rates would climb. By the 1920s, top marginal rates reached 73%. By the 1940s, they would go over 90%. Now, the truly wealthy found ways around this, of course. Trusts, foundations, creative accounting. But it was harder to maintain the absurd levels of conspicuous consumption that characterized the Gilded Age. Those million-dollar parties. Those became more difficult to justify when you were paying significant taxes. More importantly, the public started to care. Before income tax, ordinary people could read about elaborate balls and enormous mansions and feel a kind of distant awe. It was fantasy, like reading about royalty in a far-off land. But once people started paying taxes themselves, once they understood that they were contributing to government while the super wealthy lived in luxury, the tone changed. Public opinion shifted from admiration to resentment. Newspapers that had previously covered high society parties with breathless enthusiasm started writing more critically. Muckraking journalists exposed corruption and excess. The wealthy were no longer seen as aspirational figures to admire, they were seen as problems to solve. The third major force was war. World War I started in 1914 and the United States entered in 1917, and war changes everything. Suddenly, throwing a $3 million party seemed not just wasteful but unpatriotic. How could you justify spending that kind of money on champagne and decorations when young men were dying in trenches in France? When the government was asking citizens to buy war bonds and ration food? Many wealthy families scaled back during the war years, not because they could not afford lavish parties, but because it would have been inappropriate, scandalous, un-American. The social season still happened, but it was muted, quieter, less ostentatious. And once you stop doing something, even temporarily, it is hard to start again with the same intensity. The habit breaks, the expectation changes. What once seemed normal starts to seem excessive. Also, the war brought women into the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Women who had been expected to stay home and focus on marriage and children suddenly had jobs. They were working in factories, in offices, in roles that had previously been reserved for men. And that changed how women saw themselves and how society saw women. The idea that a woman's only purpose was to make a good marriage and host elegant parties started to seem outdated, limiting. Women had proven they could do more, and many of them did not want to go back to the old constraints. The fourth force, related to the third, was the women's suffrage movement. Women had been fighting for the right to vote for decades, but the movement gained enormous momentum in the 1910s, and in 1920 the 19th Amendment was ratified. Women could vote. This was huge, because it meant women had political power, real power, not just social power, not just the ability to exclude someone from a party, but the ability to influence elections, to shape policy, to participate in democracy. And here is something interesting. Alva Belmont, one of the Triumvirate, became a major supporter of women's suffrage. She used her wealth and influence to fund the movement. She hosted meetings and fundraisers. She gave speeches. She became a genuine activist. For Alva, this was probably a natural evolution. She had spent her life fighting for power in the only arena available to her: social power. But once women started fighting for political power, she pivoted. She used everything she had learned about organizing and networking and influence, and she applied it to a larger cause. It is one of the more admirable things about Alva's legacy. Yes, she was ruthless. Yes, she sacrificed her daughter's happiness for social advancement. But she also used her privilege to support a movement that would benefit all women. Not just rich women. All women. But here is the irony. By supporting women's suffrage, by helping women gain real political power, Alva was undermining the very system that had given her social power. Because once women could vote, once they could own property in their own names easily, once they could pursue careers, the old social hierarchies mattered less. A woman did not need to marry well if she could support herself. She did not need to be invited to the right parties if she had her own professional network. She did not need the approval of society queens if she had political representation. The system was eating itself. And some of the people who had benefited most from that system were the ones helping to destroy it. The fifth force was the Great Depression. The stock market crashed in 1929. Banks failed. Fortunes evaporated. Unemployment reached 25%. People lost their homes, their savings, their livelihoods. And suddenly, being part of high society did not just seem frivolous. It seemed obscene. How could anyone throw expensive parties or wear diamond tiaras when people were literally starving? When families were living in shantytowns called Hoovervilles? When the entire economic system seemed to be collapsing? Some wealthy families lost everything in the crash. The fortunes that had seemed unshakable turned out to be built on speculation and debt. The mansions were sold, the art collections auctioned off, the social positions disappeared along with the money. Other wealthy families survived financially, but lost their social relevance. Because who cared about your position in Newport society when the country was facing an existential economic crisis? The old game seemed petty, meaningless, divorced from reality. But beyond these major historical forces, there was something else happening. Something more subtle but equally powerful. The culture was changing. The Roaring Twenties brought a new attitude. Younger people rejected the stuffiness of their parents' generation. They wanted jazz and speakeasies and fast cars. They wanted to break rules, not follow them. The flappers with their short skirts and bobbed hair were not interested in being proper. They wanted to have fun. F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby in 1925, and in that novel he captured something essential about this era. The emptiness behind the glamour. The way wealth and parties and beautiful people could all add up to nothing meaningful. The way the American dream could become a hollow shell. Jay Gatsby throws enormous parties trying to win back the woman he loves. He builds a mansion. He displays his wealth. He does everything right according to the rules of the game. And it does not matter. It does not work. The woman he loves is trapped in a loveless marriage and cannot or will not leave. And Gatsby ends up dead in his swimming pool alone, with almost nobody at his funeral. That novel resonated with people because it reflected a truth they were starting to understand. Money and social position do not guarantee happiness. In fact, they can be actively destructive. The pursuit of wealth and status can consume you and leave you empty. The glamour of the Gilded Age started to look hollow. Fake. People were not impressed anymore. They were tired of it, ready for something different. And here is where we come to the personal stories, because these historical forces did not just affect society in the abstract, they affected the actual women we have been talking about, the social queens who built this world. And watching their decline is both sad and revealing. Mamie Fish died in 1915. She was only 62 years old. By that point, the social world she had dominated was already changing. The old Newport scene was fading. Younger people were not as interested in formal society. Mamie's brand of wit and entertainment was starting to seem outdated. Her funeral was well attended. People remembered her fondly. but there was a sense that an era was ending, that Mamie represented something that no longer existed. Tessie O'Elricks outlived Mamie by about a decade. She died in 1926 at age 55. By then, the Roaring Twenties were in full swing. The world had moved on completely from the formal, rigid society she had helped police. Her beautiful mansion, Rosecliff, the one she had built for $2.5 million, was becoming expensive to maintain. Eventually, her son would sell it. Tessie spent her last years watching the world she had fought so hard to be part of become increasingly irrelevant. Everything she had worked for, all the social position she had achieved, it mattered less and less as society democratized and loosened up. Alva Belmont lived the longest. She died in 1933 at age 80. And her story is actually kind of inspiring in a way. Because unlike Mamie and Tessie, who stayed focused on high society until the end, Alva pivoted. She became a political activist. She spent the last decades of her life fighting for women's rights. She founded the National Woman's Party. She wrote articles and gave speeches. She used her organizational skills and her wealth and her persistence for something beyond parties and social position. And while her relationship with her daughter Consuelo remained strained until the end, at least Alva's legacy includes something more than just social climbing. But even Alva had to watch the world she had conquered become obsolete. The rules she had learned to master no longer applied. The system she had broken into no longer mattered. Newport high society continued in some form, but it was a shadow of what it had been, less exclusive, less powerful, less relevant. The mansions are still there. You can visit them today. The Breakers, Rosecliff, Marble House, they are museums now, preserved as examples of a bygone era. You can walk through the rooms where these women once held court, see the ballrooms where they threw their legendary parties, stand in front of the photographs and try to imagine what it was like. But they are just buildings now. Beautiful, yes, impressive, certainly, but empty of the life and drama and power that once filled them. They are monuments to something that no longer exists. And I think that is the real lesson of the decline. Everything that seems permanent is temporary. Every system that seems unshakable will eventually shake. Every empire, no matter how powerful, will fall. The social queens of the Gilded Age probably thought their world would last forever, that the rules they enforced would always matter, that their descendants would inherit not just their money but their position, their relevance, their power. But the world changed. Technology, economics, politics, culture, all of it shifted beneath their feet. And the beautiful machine they had built, the intricate system of exclusion and hierarchy and performance, it stopped working. The question is whether they saw it coming. Did Caroline Astor in her final years realize that her life's work would become obsolete within a generation? Did the Triumvirate understand that they were the last of their kind, that there would be no one to replace them when they died? Maybe, maybe not. It is hard to see the end when you're living in the middle of something. Hard to imagine that what seems so important now will seem silly or quaint or irrelevant in just a few decades. But the decline was inevitable. Not because the social queens failed, not because they did anything wrong according to their own logic, but because the world they operated in was changing in ways they could not control, could not stop, could not adapt to quickly enough. And that brings us to an important question. What did they leave behind? What is the legacy of these women who dominated American high society for 40 years? What, if anything, do they contribute that lasted beyond the parties and the mansions and the diamond tiaras? That is what we need to explore next, because legacy is complicated, and the legacy of the Gilded Age social queens might surprise you. When you walk through those mansions in Newport today, the tour guides will tell you about the imported marble and the hand-painted ceilings and the cost per square foot. They will show you the ballrooms and the dining rooms and the elaborate staircases. But what they rarely talk about is the women themselves, the actual human beings who lived in these spaces, who fought and schemed and suffered and triumphed within these walls. History has a strange way of remembering buildings better than people. We preserve the mansions but forget the women who built them. We protect the artifacts but lose the stories. And that raises an interesting question. What is the real legacy of these social queens? What did they leave behind that actually matters? Let me start with the most obvious legacy: architecture. The mansions of the Gilded Age are genuinely remarkable. The Breakers, Marble House, Rosecliff, these are not just big houses, they are architectural achievements, designed by the best architects in America, inspired by the great palaces of Europe, built with materials imported from around the world, decorated by master craftsmen who spent years perfecting every detail. Stanford White designed Rosecliff for Tessie Ullrichs. Richard Morris Hunt designed Marble House for Alva Vanderbilt and the Breakers for the Cornelius Vanderbilt family. These men were geniuses of their craft, and they were given unlimited budgets to create something extraordinary. The result? Buildings that are still stunning over a century later. Buildings that teach us about design and craftsmanship and ambition. Buildings that have been preserved so that millions of people can visit and experience a glimpse of that era. Is that a meaningful legacy? I think yes, because these buildings inspire. They show what is possible when you combine vision with resources. They demonstrate standards of quality that are rare today, and they connect us to a specific moment in American history. But here is the thing. These buildings were not actually designed by the women. They hired the architects, they chose the styles, they made decisions about details, but they were not the creators, they were the clients, the patrons. So the architectural legacy is real but complicated. The women made it possible, but they did not make it themselves. What about the more personal legacies, the ways these women actually shaped culture and society? That is where things get really interesting. First, fashion. The women of the Gilded Age were fashion icons. What they wore influenced what other wealthy women wore, and what wealthy women wore eventually influenced everyone. Fashion trickles down. These women were importing the latest styles from Paris, working with the most prestigious fashion houses: Charles Frederick Worth, Jacques Doucet, Callot-Surs. They were essentially early fashion influencers, and they had real impact. The elaborate gowns, the corseted silhouettes, the use of specific colours and fabrics for specific occasions, the emphasis on constantly changing styles so that nothing was ever worn more than once or twice. All of this shaped American fashion culture. But is that a positive legacy? Arguable, because the fashion culture they created was based on consumption, on waste, on constantly buying new things, on using clothes as status symbols rather than functional items. That is a legacy we are still dealing with. Fast fashion, disposable clothing, the idea that you need a new outfit for every occasion. So fashion is a real legacy, but not necessarily a good one. Second, event planning. The parties these women threw were elaborate productions. They required months of planning, coordination between multiple vendors, management of complex logistics, attention to every detail. Alva's 1883 ball, Tessie's white ball, Mamie's outrageous themed parties. These were not just gatherings, they were events, experiences, productions. And in doing this, these women essentially invented modern event planning. The idea that you could throw a party that was not just about the food and the guests, but about creating an entire experience, a theme, a narrative, a memorable occasion. Today, event planners are professionals. It is a legitimate industry. People make careers out of designing weddings and corporate events and fundraisers. And a lot of the techniques they use, the attention to detail and theme and experience, that comes from what these Gilded Age women pioneered. So that is a real legacy. A positive one, arguably. They showed that events could be art forms, that creating memorable experiences required skill and vision and effort. Third, social networking. And I do not mean Facebook or Instagram, I mean the actual practice of building and maintaining networks of influential people. These women understood networking better than almost anyone. They knew who mattered, who to connect with whom, how to use social connections to achieve goals, how to maintain relationships over time. Caroline Astor's 400 was essentially an early social network, a curated list of important people, a system for managing relationships and influence. The calling cards, the formal visits, the strategic invitations, all of this was sophisticated relationship management. Today we think of networking as a business skill. LinkedIn profiles, professional associations, industry conferences. But the fundamental techniques, building relationships, maintaining connections, using social capital strategically, that is what these women were doing over a century ago. So that is another real legacy. They understood that relationships were currency, that who you knew mattered as much as what you knew, and they built systems for managing those relationships that we still use today in modified forms. Fourth, philanthropy. Now this is complicated because most of these women were not known primarily for charity work. They were known for parties and social climbing. But many of them did engage in philanthropy, especially later in their lives. Alva Belmont gave significant amounts of money to the women's suffrage movement. She funded organizations, she hosted fundraisers, she used her wealth for a cause beyond herself. Other wealthy women from this era established libraries, hospitals, museums, educational institutions. They endowed universities. They supported the arts. They created foundations that still exist today. The culture of wealthy philanthropy that we see now, where billionaires are expected to give away significant portions of their wealth, that has roots in the Gilded Age. Not just from these women specifically, but from the general culture of wealthy people using some of their money for public benefit. Is this a positive legacy? Mostly yes. But it is also worth noting that philanthropy can be a way of maintaining power and control. When you give away money, you get to decide where it goes, what causes are worthy, what organizations deserve support. That is a form of power too. So philanthropy is a real legacy, but a complicated one. Fifth, and this is the one that I find most interesting, these women demonstrated female ambition in an era that tried to suppress it. Think about what these women actually did. They built empires. Social empires, yes, but empires nonetheless. They competed ruthlessly. They strategized brilliantly, and they exercised power. They made decisions that affected thousands of people. They created systems and enforced rules and shaped an entire social landscape. All of this required intelligence, creativity, leadership, vision, determination, all the qualities we associate with successful people in any field. But these women lived in an era when they were not allowed to be CEOs or politicians or generals or professors. They could not vote. They could not own property easily. They could not pursue professional careers. The only arena available to them was society. So they poured all their ambition and intelligence into that arena, and they excelled. That is actually inspiring in a way, because it shows that female ambition has always existed. Women have always wanted power and influence and achievement. The constraints of their era channeled that ambition into specific directions, but the ambition itself was real. Today women can be anything. CEOs, politicians, scientists, artists, entrepreneurs. The barriers have not completely disappeared, but they are lower than they were in 1890. And that progress happened partly because women like Alva Belmont stopped accepting the limitations placed on them. They pushed boundaries. They fought for suffrage. They demanded more. So in a strange way, these women who seem so old-fashioned and frivolous, they were actually pioneers, not perfect pioneers, not always admirable pioneers, but pioneers nonetheless. That might be their most important legacy. The demonstration that women could wield power if given the opportunity. That female leadership was not just possible, but formidable. Sixth, documentation. We know so much about this era, partly because these people documented everything: the photographs, the newspaper coverage, the memoirs, the letters, the preserved mansions. They wanted to be remembered. They wanted their achievements recorded. They understood that history matters, and they made sure their version of history was preserved. Today, historians can study this era in detail because the evidence exists. We have photographs of the costumes from Alva's ball, we have newspaper accounts of the parties, we have Ward McAllister's memoir, we have Consuelo Vanderbilt's autobiography, we have the buildings themselves. This documentation allows us to learn from this era, to understand what worked and what did not, to see the consequences of extreme inequality, to observe how social systems function and eventually fail. So documentation is a real legacy, the gift of historical knowledge. 7th, cultural touchstones. The Gilded Age has entered our collective imagination. When we think about American wealth and excess, we often reference this era: The Great Gatsby, Downton Abbey, the current HBO series The Gilded Age. These stories resonate because they tap into something we recognize. The Gilded Age has become shorthand for a specific kind of society, one where appearance mattered more than substance, where wealth was flaunted rather than hidden, where rigid hierarchies determined your worth, where the gap between rich and poor was enormous and visible. And when people today talk about wealth inequality, they often reference the Gilded Age. They say we are living in a new Gilded Age, that the concentration of wealth today rivals or exceeds what existed then, that we need to learn from the mistakes of that era to avoid repeating them. So the Gilded Age has become a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when inequality gets too extreme, when the wealthy become too detached from everyone else, when society becomes too rigidly divided. That is a powerful legacy. Not just the history itself, but what that history teaches us about our current moment. Now let me talk about something that does not get discussed enough: the story of parallel societies. Because while we have been focusing on the white wealthy women of New York high society, there was another world existing at the same time. Black high society, sometimes called the Colored 400 or the Black 400. Wealthy and educated Black Americans who created their own social networks, their own standards, their own communities. They could not be part of white high society no matter how wealthy or educated they were. The racial barriers were absolute, so they built their own structures. Organizations like the Social Circle in Washington, D.C., the Friday Evening Coterie in Cleveland, the Bachelor Benedict Club in New York. These were accomplished people, doctors, lawyers, educators, entrepreneurs, ministers, people who had achieved success despite enormous obstacles. And they created social networks that celebrated Black achievement and provided community and support. This parallel society is part of the legacy too. The reminder that while some people were fighting to be included in white high society, other people were building their own alternatives, creating their own definitions of success and status and community. The Black elite of the Gilded Age deserves its own detailed exploration. Their stories are equally compelling, equally complex, equally important. And the fact that they are less well known than the white social queens tells us something about whose stories get preserved and whose get forgotten. So when we talk about the legacy of Gilded Age high society, we need to remember it was not the only society, not the only game being played. Other communities were building their own structures, their own legacies, and those deserve recognition too. Bringing this all together, what is the actual legacy of the social queens? What should we remember about Caroline Astor and Alva Vanderbilt and Mamie Fish and Tessie Ulrichs? I think the legacy was complicated, mixed, not entirely good, but not entirely bad either. On the positive side, they demonstrated female capability. They created architectural and cultural achievements that still resonate. They pioneered techniques in event planning and networking that we still use. They documented their era thoroughly. Some of them, like Alva, eventually used their power for meaningful social causes. On the negative side, they enforced harmful hierarchies, they wasted enormous resources, they created cultures of consumption and exclusion. They hurt people who did not meet their arbitrary standards. They sacrificed personal happiness, including their children's happiness, for social position. They were not heroes, but they were not simple villains either. They were complex human beings navigating a specific historical moment, making choices within constraints we can barely imagine, wielding what power they had in the only ways available to them. The real legacy might be the questions their lives raise. Questions about power, about gender, about wealth and inequality, about what we value and why, about the price of ambition, about the cost of fitting in versus the cost of standing out. These are not historical questions, these are current questions. We still grapple with all of them today, and by understanding how these women answered them in their era, maybe we can think more clearly about how we answer them in ours. What do you think? Were these women pioneers or prisoners, innovators or imitators, heroes or villains? The answer is probably all of the above, and that complexity is part of what makes their story worth telling. But there is one more layer to this story, one more group of people whose stories have been almost completely forgotten. The people who made all of this possible but received none of the credit, the invisible labor force that kept the Gilded world running. We need to talk about the army of servants who actually built and maintained this society from behind the scenes. For every woman in a diamond tiara, there were 30 people you never saw. For every guest at a glittering ball, there were 50 workers who made that ball possible. For every mansion that impressed visitors, there was an army of servants who cleaned and maintained and operated every aspect of that house. This is the story history almost never tells. The story of the people who did the actual work, who made the elaborate lifestyle of the Gilded Age physically possible, who saw everything but were expected to be invisible, who knew all the secrets but were required to keep them. Let me give you some numbers first, because the scale of domestic service in this era is hard to grasp from our modern perspective. A typical large mansion in Newport might employ between 30 and 50 full-time servants. Some of the biggest houses had over 70. And this was just for one family, for one household, during one summer season. The Breakers, the Vanderbilt mansion, had about 40 servants during the summer season. Marble House had a similar number. These were not occasional workers. These were people who lived in the house, who worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7, who were on call essentially all the time. Now think about the social season. Multiple families, multiple mansions, all requiring full staffs. We're talking about thousands of people working in domestic service just in Newport alone. And that is not counting the workers in New York, or the servants who travelled with families, or the specialised workers who came in for specific events. This was an entire hidden economy, an invisible workforce that made the visible world of high society function. Let me walk you through the hierarchy of servants, because it was just as stratified as the society above stairs, just as rigid, just as carefully organised. At the top of the servant hierarchy was the butler, almost always male, almost always British or trained in the British style. The butler managed the male servants. He oversaw the dining room. He was responsible for the wine cellar and the silver, and ensuring that meals were served perfectly. A good butler could make or break a household. He represented the family to visitors. He maintained standards. He enforced discipline among the other servants. And he was paid well for this responsibility. A top butler in the 1890s might make $600 to $800 a year. That is roughly $20,000 in today's money. Not bad, but also not enough to live like the people he served. Then there was the housekeeper, usually female, usually older. She managed the female servants. She was responsible for the cleaning, the laundry, the maintenance of linens and household supplies. She kept the household accounts, she ordered supplies, she made sure everything ran smoothly. The housekeeper had enormous responsibility but less prestige than the butler, because that is how the gender hierarchy worked. Even among servants, men outranked women. Below the butler and housekeeper were specialized servants, the lady's maid, the valet, the cook, the chef if the family was wealthy enough to employ French cuisine specialists. These were skilled positions that required training and experience. A lady's maid was responsible for everything related to her employer's appearance and wardrobe. She helped her dress, she styled her hair, she maintained and repaired clothing, she packed for travel. She knew all her employer's secrets because she saw her at her most vulnerable. First thing in the morning, last thing at night, during moments of stress or illness or unhappiness. The relationship between a society woman and her lady's maid could be complex, sometimes close, almost intimate, sometimes distant and purely transactional, but always unequal. No matter how much the lady trusted her maid, that maid was still a servant, still subject to dismissal, still vulnerable. Below the skilled servants were the general servants, footmen, housemaids, kitchen maids, scullery maids. These were the people who did the hard physical labor, carrying coal, hauling water, scrubbing floors, washing dishes, cleaning fireplaces, polishing silver, doing laundry by hand. The work was exhausting. You might start at 5 or 6 in the morning and work until 10 or 11 at night, with brief breaks for meals, 6 days a week, sometimes 7 if there was a big event. And the pay was terrible. A housemaid might make $150 to $250 a year. That is about $6,000 in today's money. For year-round work, for giving up essentially your entire life to maintain someone else's comfort. At the very bottom of the hierarchy were the temporary workers, the people hired just for specific events. Extra servers for a big dinner party, additional cleaning staff after a ball, laundresses who came in to handle the massive amounts of laundry generated by households with dozens of people. These workers were paid even less, sometimes just a few dollars for a night's work. They had no job security, no benefits, no protection. They could be hired in the afternoon and dismissed the next morning with no recourse. Now let me tell you what daily life was actually like for these servants. Because it was not romantic or glamorous or anything like what you see in movies, servants lived in the least desirable parts of the house, small rooms in the attic or basement, no heat in winter, no cooling in summer, minimal privacy, often multiple people sharing one small room. The accommodations were deliberately uncomfortable because servants were not supposed to spend time in their quarters. They were supposed to work. They used separate staircases, servant stairs, narrow, steep, hidden from view, because servants were not supposed to be seen unless they were actively serving. If you were a guest in one of these mansions, you might never consciously notice the servants even though they were everywhere. That was the point. Visibility was failure. Perfect service was invisible service. Meals were eaten in the servants' hall, not with the family obviously, but also not at the same time. Servants ate the food left over from family meals, or simpler versions of what the family ate, and they ate in strict hierarchical order. The butler and housekeeper first, the skilled servants next, the general servants last. The division never stopped, even in the servants' own space. And the rules. Oh, the rules. Servants had to follow elaborate codes of behaviour, never speak unless spoken to, never make eye contact with family members or guests, never be seen carrying anything unpleasant. If you were carrying coal or ashes or dirty laundry and you heard someone coming, you were supposed to hide, duck into a side room, stand facing the wall, become invisible. Female servants often had to wear uniforms, different uniforms for different times of day. Black dress with white apron for morning cleaning, better black dress with fancier apron for afternoon, special uniforms for serving dinner. You had to look perfect all the time, even when doing filthy work. Male servants wore livery, fancy uniforms in the house colours, like a costume, like they were playing a role in someone else's fantasy, which in a way they were. Servants could be fooled for almost anything, being too visible, being too friendly with family members, making a mistake during service, having a relationship with another servant, getting pregnant, getting sick, getting old. There was no protection, no recourse, no union to defend you. And here is something particularly cruel. Many households had rules against servants marrying. If you married, you had to leave your position. This meant people who wanted to marry had to choose between love and survival, between having a family and having a job. Imagine being 25 years old, working as a maid, meeting someone you love, but knowing that if you marry him, you will lose your job and have no way to support yourself. What do? Some people married in secret, some people gave up on marriage entirely, some people left service and struggled to find other work. The system was designed to keep servants powerless, dependent, vulnerable, unable to organise or demand better treatment because there was always someone else desperate enough to take your place. But here is what I find remarkable. Despite all of this, despite the terrible conditions and the low pay and the constant vulnerability, servants maintained their dignity. They took pride in their work, they developed their own culture and community. They supported each other. There are accounts of servants organising secret parties on their days off, creating their own social networks, falling in love and finding ways to maintain relationships despite the rules, saving money little by little, hoping to eventually escape service and do something else. Some servants did escape. They saved enough to open small businesses, or they married someone outside of service and started different lives, or they immigrated to other countries where opportunities were better. These success stories existed, but they were rare. Most people stayed in service because they had no other option. Now let me talk about the specific indignities of serving the super wealthy, because it was not just about hard work, it was about the constant reminder that you did not matter. Servants were often referred to by their job title rather than their name. Butler instead of James, cook instead of Mary, as if their identity was entirely defined by their function, as if they were interchangeable parts in a machine rather than human beings. They were expected to have no personal needs, no illness, no exhaustion, no emotional reactions. You could not cry even if you received news that a family member died. You could not complain even if you were injured. You certainly could not object if you were treated unfairly or abusively, and abuse happened. Sexual harassment of female servants by male family members or guests, physical punishment for mistakes, psychological cruelty. Servants had no legal recourse. If a wealthy man assaulted a maid, who would believe her? Who would take her side against a man with money and power and social position? Some households were better than others. Some families treated their servants decently, with basic respect and fairness. But even in the best households, the fundamental inequality remained. You were not family, you were not equal, you were there to serve, and that was all you would ever be. Here is something that haunts me. When you walk through those preserved mansions today, when you admire the architecture and the decorations and the elaborate furnishings, you are seeing the product of uncounted hours of invisible labour. Someone polished every piece of silver. Someone cleaned every window. Someone maintained every yard of elaborate drapery. Someone scrubbed every floor. Someone hauled every bucket of coal. Someone washed every dish. Someone ironed every tablecloth. The beauty you see was built on the backs of people who got no credit, who are not remembered, who do not have their portraits hanging on the walls or their names inscribed on plaques. They created the setting for other people's glory, and then they disappeared from history. We do not know most of their names, we do not know their stories. We do not know what they thought about the people they served or the lives they led. Because servants rarely left written records. They did not have time to write memoirs. They did not have money to commission portraits. They did not have social status that made newspapers care about their lives. What we know about servants comes mostly from household accounts, lists of names and wages, brief mentions in letters or diaries written by the wealthy people they served. Occasional newspaper articles about crimes or scandals involving servants. It is like trying to reconstruct someone's entire life from their expense receipts. You get facts but not feelings, numbers but not narratives. There are exceptions. A few servants wrote memoirs later in life. A few interviews were recorded. From these we get glimpses of what it was really like. The exhaustion, the loneliness, the small moments of joy or connection, the dreams of something better. But these are rare. Most servant stories are lost forever. And this is part of the legacy too. The Gilded Age was built on invisible labour, on people whose work was essential but unrecognized, on a massive wealth gap that allowed some people to live in extraordinary luxury while others scrubbed their floors for pennies. When we talk about wealth inequality today, when we talk about essential workers who are underpaid and undervalued, we are talking about problems that have deep historical roots. The Gilded Age did not invent inequality, but it perfected a particular version of it. A system where massive wealth for a few required poverty for many, where luxury was literally built on exploitation. Is that too harsh a judgment? I do not think so, because the system was designed to work this way. It was not an accident. It was not an unfortunate side effect. The wealth of the Gilded Age elite was directly connected to the low wages paid to workers, including servants. You could only afford 30 servants if you paid them almost nothing. The math is simple. And the social queens we've been talking about, Caroline Astor and Alva Vanderbilt and the Triumvirate, they benefited from this system. They did not create it alone, obviously, but they participated in it. They profited from it. Their beautiful clothes and elaborate parties and legendary social battles, all of that was made possible by armies of underpaid workers. Does that make everything we have discussed meaningless? Does it negate their achievements or make their stories not worth telling? Sure. I do not think so. But it does complicate things. It adds another layer of moral complexity to an already complicated history. We can acknowledge that these women were intelligent and strategic and powerful within their sphere. We can recognize that they faced real constraints and found creative ways to exercise agency. And we can also acknowledge that their power depended on systems of exploitation. Both things can be true simultaneously. History is almost never simple, almost never cleanly heroic or villainous. It is messy and complicated and full of contradiction. And the story of Gilded Age high society is a perfect example of that complexity. Beautiful mansions built by underpaid workers, elaborate parties that required invisible labour, social power that depended on economic inequality, female agency that coexisted with the exploitation of other women. It is all connected, all part of the same system. And understanding that system, seeing how all these pieces fit together, that is how we learn from history, not by celebrating or condemning, but by understanding, by seeing clearly what was, and by thinking about how it relates to what is now. Because here is the thing, we still have invisible workers, people who clean office buildings at night, people who harvest food in fields, people who pack boxes in warehouses, people who deliver packages to our doors, people whose labour makes our comfortable lives possible, but who we rarely think about or acknowledge. The Gilded Age was over a century ago, but some of its patterns persist. And maybe by understanding how that system worked, by really seeing the invisible workers who made it function, we can think more clearly about the invisible workers in our own time. As we move toward the end of our story, we need to pull all of these threads together. The social queens and their battles, the mansions and the parties, the marriages and the misery, the rise and the fall, the legacy and the lessons, and the invisible workers who made it all possible. What does it all mean? What should we take away from this strange, fascinating, troubling piece of American history? That is what we explore in our final chapters. Standing at the end of this story, looking back at everything we've explored, I keep coming back to one question. What was it all for? All the elaborate parties, all the strategic marriages, all the social warfare, all the diamonds and mansions and carefully orchestrated performances, all the suffering and sacrifice and desperate pursuit of acceptance. What did any of it accomplish? What did it mean? The easy answer is nothing. It was all vanity and frivolity, a waste of time and money and human potential, distraction from more important things. And there is some truth to that. But I think the real answer is more complicated, more interesting, and more relevant to our lives today than you might expect. Let me start with the most important lesson. Power is always about control, and the form power takes depends on what options are available. The social queens of the Gilded Age were not born wanting to control who got invited to parties. They did not spend their childhoods dreaming about creating exclusive social hierarchies, but they lived in a world where that was the only form of power accessible to them. So they pursued it with everything they had. Think about Caroline Astor, brilliant woman, strategic mind, natural leader. If she had been born 100 years later, she might have been a CEO, a politician, a general, a university president. She had all the qualities needed for those roles. The vision, the organizational skills, the ability to manage complex systems and make tough decisions. But she was born in 1830. And in 1830, women could not be CEOs or politicians or generals or university presidents. So she channeled all that ambition and intelligence into the only arena available, high society, and she dominated it. The lesson? People will use whatever tools they have access to. If you deny someone legitimate paths to power, they will find illegitimate ones. Or they will create entirely new structures. Or they will excel within whatever limited sphere you allow them. This applies far beyond 19th century society women. Think about any marginalized group throughout history. When denied access to mainstream power structures, they create their own organizations, their own networks, their own definitions of success and status. The Black 400 we talked about earlier? Perfect example. Excluded from white society, they built their own. And their society had its own standards, its own hierarchies, its own forms of exclusion and inclusion. Because the impulse to create structure and status seems to be deeply human. We do it whether we are allowed into existing systems or not. The second lesson is about the cost of performing identity, about the price of maintaining an image. Every single woman we have talked about was performing. Caroline Astor performed queenly authority. Alva Vanderbilt performed aristocratic refinement. Mamie Fish performed witty irreverence. Tessie Ulrichs performed strict standards. Harry Lair performed charming companionship while hiding his true self. Consuelo Vanderbilt performed dutiful daughter and then performed unhappy duchess. All of them were wearing masks, playing roles, maintaining facades, and that performance was exhausting, costly. It consumed their entire lives. They could never relax, never be fully authentic, never stop calculating how they were being perceived. And for what? For social position that proved temporary? For power that evaporated? For acceptance into systems that ultimately did not matter? Now, before you think this is just about rich people in the past, ask yourself, how much of your life is performance? How much energy do you spend maintaining an image? On social media? At work? In social situations? How often are you truly yourself versus playing a version of yourself that you think others want to see? The technology has changed. The platforms have changed. But the fundamental dynamic, that is the same. We are still performing identity, still seeking acceptance, still exhausting ourselves trying to fit into systems and impress people and maintain carefully constructed images. The difference is we have more options now, more ways to be authentic if we choose. The constraints are looser. but the temptation to perform is still powerful, and the cost is still high. The third lesson is about wealth and happiness, about the lie that money solves problems. The women in our story had everything money could buy, literally everything. Mansions, jewels, clothes, servants, travel, food, art, access to the finest things in the world, and many of them were profoundly unhappy. Loveless marriages, estranged relationships, lonely lives, sacrificed children, constant anxiety about maintaining position, the hollow feeling of winning games that did not matter. Money gave them comfort, security, options, but it did not give them fulfillment. It did not give them love or meaning or authentic connection. In some ways, their wealth made them less free rather than more, because they had so much to lose, so much to protect, so many expectations to meet. This is not to romanticize poverty. Being poor is hard and limiting and often miserable. Money absolutely matters, but there is a point where additional wealth stops improving your life and starts complicating it, where it becomes a burden rather than a blessing. And many of these Gilded Age families crossed that point long ago. They had so much money that it became its own problem. How do you manage multiple mansions? How do you maintain enormous staffs? How do you handle the expectations that come with being super wealthy? How do you trust that people like you for yourself rather than your money? How do you find meaning when you can have anything except the things that actually matter? These are problems most people would love to have, obviously, but they are still problems, and they are problems we are seeing again today, because we are living through a new Gilded Age. Wealth inequality is approaching or exceeding the levels from the 1890s, and the super wealthy today face many of the same issues: the isolation, the distrust, the difficulty finding authentic connection, the sense that despite having everything, something essential is missing. The fourth lesson is about the danger of building your identity entirely around external validation. The social queens needed constant reinforcement, constant proof that they mattered, that they were important, that they were accepted. They built elaborate systems to generate that validation. The parties, the social hierarchies, the exclusivity, all of it was designed to confirm their status. But external validation is unstable. It depends on other people continuing to care, continuing to play by your rules, continuing to give you the recognition you crave. And when the world changes, when society moves on, when new generations stop caring about the old games, that validation disappears. And if your entire identity was built on it, you are left with nothing. That is what happened to many of these women. They spent their lives accumulating social capital, building reputations, establishing positions. And then the world changed and none of it mattered anymore. Their achievements became irrelevant. Their power evaporated. Their carefully constructed identities collapsed. This is a trap we still fall into, defining ourselves by job titles, by social media metrics, by what other people think of us, by achievements that could be taken away, by statuses that are temporary, by games that might stop being played. The solution: build identity on things that are internal rather than external, on values rather than validation, on who you are rather than how you're perceived, on what gives you meaning rather than what impresses other people. Easy to say, hard to do, but worth attempting. The fifth lesson is about the complexity of judging historical figures, about resisting the temptation to make people into simple heroes or villains. Throughout this story, I have tried to show you the full picture, the impressive and the awful, the strategic brilliance and the moral failures, the genuine achievements and the terrible costs, because that is the only honest way to engage with history. Caroline Astor created an entire social system. That takes vision and skill. She also used that system to exclude and hurt people. Both things are true. Alva Vanderbilt broke barriers and fought for women's suffrage. Impressive. She also forced her daughter into a miserable marriage for social gain. Terrible. Both things are true. Mamie Fish brought joy and entertainment to her world. Wonderful. She also wielded social power cruelly. Harmful. Both things are true. None of these women were saints. None were pure villains. They were complex humans making choices within specific constraints. Sometimes wise choices, sometimes selfish ones, sometimes brave, sometimes cowardly, often contradictory. And that is how most of us are too. We are not simple. We are not consistent. We do good things and bad things. We have admirable qualities and serious flaws. We are products of our time while also trying to transcend our limitations. So when we judge historical figures, we should judge with nuance, with context, with acknowledgement of complexity, not to excuse genuine harm, but to understand it, to see it clearly, to learn from both the successes and the failures. The sixth lesson is about systemic change versus individual achievement, about the difference between adapting to a broken system and fixing it. The social queens we have discussed were mostly adapters. They learned the rules of their society and played by them. Sometimes they bent the rules, sometimes they changed specific aspects, but they fundamentally accepted the system. They wanted in, not out. They wanted to rise, not to transform. There are exceptions. Alva's work on women's suffrage was genuinely transformative. She used her position within the system to change the system. That is meaningful. That is legacy that lasted. But mostly these women were focused on personal achievement within existing structures, climbing the hierarchy rather than dismantling it, gaining power rather than redistributing it, succeeding according to established standards rather than questioning those standards. And there is value in individual achievement. There is nothing wrong with wanting to succeed, with pursuing excellence, with making the best of the options available to you. But there is also something limiting about accepting the system as it is, about never questioning whether the game is worth playing, about mistaking personal success for collective progress. The real changemakers are the people who refuse to play by the rules, who reject the existing systems entirely, who imagine different possibilities, who fight for structural transformation rather than personal advancement. Those people rarely get the mansions or the parties or the society pages. They get resistance, criticism, often poverty and struggle. But they are the ones who actually change the world, who make it possible for future generations to have better options, to live more freely, to be more fully human. The seventh lesson is about remembering the forgotten, about whose stories get preserved and whose get lost. We know so much about Caroline Astor and Alva Vanderbilt because they were wealthy and powerful. Their lives were documented. Their homes were preserved. Their stories were considered worth telling. But we know almost nothing about the servants who made their lives possible, or the working class people who lived in the same city but in completely different circumstances, or the immigrants who were arriving in New York by the thousands during this same period. History tends to preserve the stories of the powerful and forget everyone else, and that creates a distorted picture. We see the top of the pyramid but not the foundation. We see the performance but not the stage crew. We see the glamour but not the cost. Part of learning from history is consciously remembering to ask about the people who were left out. Who was not in the room? Whose labour made this possible? Who was excluded? Who paid the price for someone else's success? These questions make history more complete, more honest, more useful, because they reveal systems and patterns that the official stories try to hide. The eighth lesson is about legacy and what actually lasts, about the difference between fame and impact, between being remembered and mattering. The social queens wanted to be remembered. They wanted their names to endure, their achievements to be celebrated, their places in history to be secure, and in a way they got what they wanted. We are still talking about them, still visiting their mansions, still fascinated by their stories. But what actually lasted? What real impact did they have? The mansions are museums now, beautiful but empty. The social hierarchies they created are gone. The rules they enforced are obsolete. The power they wielded has evaporated. Their names are remembered, but mostly as curiosities, as examples of a bygone era, as cautionary tales about excess and inequality. What has lasted is more subtle. The questions they raised about gender and power, the demonstration of female capability, the architectural achievements, the cultural templates they created, the ways they influenced fashion and entertaining and social organization, the lessons about wealth and performance and the cost of ambition. These legacies are real, but not what they intended. They wanted to build permanent social empires. Instead, they became illustrations of impermanence. They wanted to prove their superiority. Instead, they demonstrated human complexity. They wanted glory. Instead, they gave us something more valuable: understanding. The 9th lesson is probably the most important. It is about the patterns that repeat, about how understanding history helps us recognize what is happening in our own time. We are living through a new Gilded Age. Wealth concentration is extreme, social inequality is vast. The super wealthy live in ways that seem disconnected from normal life. And there are new social hierarchies, new ways of performing status, new methods of exclusion and inclusion. The technology is different. The platforms are different. But the dynamics are similar. People competing for status, building identities around external validation, using wealth to create barriers, maintaining elaborate performances, sacrificing authenticity for acceptance. Social media influencers are the new society queens. Instagram is the new Newport. The algorithms that determine visibility are the new 400. The verification checkmarks and follow accounts are the new calling cards. The carefully curated feeds are the new elaborate costumes. And the costs are similar too. The anxiety, the performance exhaustion, the hollowness behind the glamour, the realization that winning these games does not necessarily bring fulfillment. Understanding Gilded Age. High society helps us see our own moment more clearly, helps us recognize patterns, helps us ask better questions, helps us make better choices about what games we play and why. Because here is the thing. Every generation thinks their situation is unique, their challenges unprecedented, their world fundamentally different from anything that came before. And in some ways that is true. Technology changes, culture evolves, new possibilities emerge, but human nature, that is remarkably consistent. The desire for status, the need for belonging, the fear of exclusion, the appeal of performing identity, the costs of inauthenticity, these are timeless patterns, and they play out differently in each era, but the fundamental dynamics remain. So when we study history, we are not just learning about the past, we're learning about patterns, about human behavior, about system and incentives and consequences. We are gaining tools for understanding our own lives, our own choices, our own moment in time. And that brings us to the final question. After everything we have learned, after all these stories and lessons and complications, what should we actually do with this knowledge? How should it change how we live? What practical wisdom can we extract from this strange, fascinating, troubling history? That is what we explore in our final chapter. Because knowledge without application is just entertainment, and this story deserves to be more than that. So here we are. At the end of a journey that took us through mansions and ballrooms, through triumph and tragedy, through glittering facades and hidden darkness, we met women who built empires of exclusivity. We saw how those empires rose and fell. We learned about the people who made it all possible and the people who paid the price. And now comes the most important question. What do we do with all of this? How does understanding the social queens of the Gilded Age actually change how we live our lives today? Let me offer you some practical wisdom. Not rules, not commandments, but invitations. Ways of thinking that might make your life richer and more authentic and more meaningful. Lessons distilled from over a century of distance and perspective. First, choose authenticity over approval every single time. The women in our story spent their entire lives seeking approval. From society, from each other, from a system that constantly moved the goalposts. And even when they won, even when they got the acceptance they craved, it did not satisfy them. Because approval from others can never fill the void that comes from abandoning yourself. You know what I am talking about. That feeling when you say yes to something you want to say no to. When you pretend to like something you do not actually like. When you perform a version of yourself that is not quite real because you think that is what people want to see. That feeling is exhausting and it is unnecessary. Here is a secret the social queens never learned. The people who are truly magnetic, truly influential, truly remembered, they are the ones who are authentically themselves. Flaws and all, contradictions and all, they are not trying to fit a template. They are creating their own shape. And that authenticity is what draws people in. So practice saying no to things that do not align with who you are. Practice expressing opinions even when they are unpopular. Practice showing up as yourself instead of as who you think you should be. It is scary at first, but it gets easier. And it leads to so much more genuine connection than any performance ever could. Second, build your identity on values rather than achievements. The social queens built their identities entirely on external markers, their position in society, their wealth, their invitations to the right parties, their place in the hierarchy, and when those external markers disappeared, their identities crumbled. They had nothing solid underneath. Do not make that mistake. Figure out what you actually value, what matters to you beyond accomplishments and status. Kindness, creativity, justice, learning, connection, whatever it is, let those values be the foundation of who you are. Because values are steady. They do not depend on other people's opinions. They do not evaporate when circumstances change. They do not get taken away when you lose a job or a relationship or a social position. They are yours forever. And an identity built on values is unshakable. This does not mean you should not pursue achievements. Pursue them, work hard, excel at things, but let those achievements be expressions of your values rather than the foundation of your identity. Let them be things you do rather than who you are. Third, recognize that every system of hierarchy is arbitrary and temporary. The 400 seemed permanent. The rules of high society seemed unbreakable. The power of the social queen seemed unshakable, and then it all disappeared. Within a generation, nobody cared anymore. The elaborate system that had consumed so many lives just stopped mattering. Every hierarchy you encounter is like that. Your workplace hierarchy, your social media status, your position in whatever communities you're a part of. They all feel important right now. They all seem permanent, but they are not. They are constructs, games people invented, and games can change or end or become irrelevant. This does not mean you should not participate, but it means you should not invest your entire sense of worth in your position within these systems, because that position is fragile, temporary, subject to forces beyond your control. Instead, focus on things that transcend any particular hierarchy. Your relationships, your skills, your character, your impact on individual lives. These things have value regardless of your rank in any system. Fourth, remember that exploitation is always part of extreme luxury. When you see someone living in extraordinary wealth, living in ways that seem impossibly lavish, remember that wealth came from somewhere. It was extracted from somewhere. Someone's labor is being undervalued. Someone's resources are being concentrated in a few hands. The mansion required builders who were paid less than the value they created. The elaborate lifestyle requires servants who are compensated less than their work is worth. This is not to make you feel guilty about wanting comfort or success, but it is an invitation to think about ethics and fairness, to ask questions about systems, to consider what fair compensation looks like, to resist the seduction of extreme wealth as an ideal. The Gilded Age shows us what happens when inequality gets too extreme, when the wealthy become too detached from everyone else, when luxury is built on exploitation. The system eventually becomes unstable, unsustainable, destructive even for the people at the top. So as you build your own life, as you pursue your own success, keep asking, is this fair? Is this sustainable? Am I building something that creates value for others, or am I just extracting it? Those questions matter more than you might think. Fifth, invest in relationships that are genuine rather than transactional. The social world of the Gilded Age was entirely transactional. Every friendship was strategic. Every alliance had a purpose. Every relationship was evaluated based on what it could do for your social position. And as a result, most of these people were profoundly lonely despite being constantly surrounded by others. Do not make that mistake. Cultivate relationships based on genuine connection. People you can be real with. People who see you at your worst and still care. People who want your happiness more than they want something from you. These relationships are rare and precious, and they are worth more than any amount of social capital. Yes, networking matters. Professional connections are valuable. But distinguish between those necessary strategic relationships and the relationships that feed your soul. Make sure you have both. Make sure the genuine ones get priority. Because at the end of your life, what will matter is not how many important people you knew. It is how deeply you connected with anyone, how much you loved and were loved, how many people's lives you touched in meaningful ways. That is the currency that actually matters. Sixth, question what you are performing and why. We talked about how exhausting it was for these women to constantly perform their identities, to always be on stage, to never relax into authenticity, and we acknowledge that we still do this. Social media, professional personas, carefully curated images. So start noticing when you are performing, when you are editing yourself, when you are calculating how something will be perceived rather than just doing or saying what feels true. And then ask why. What are you afraid will happen if you stop performing? What are you trying to achieve? Is it worth the cost? Sometimes performance is necessary. Sometimes you need to be professional or diplomatic or strategic. That is fine, but make it a choice rather than a default. Be conscious about when you are performing and when you are not, and give yourself permission to perform less, to be more raw, more real, more human. The people who seem most alive, most compelling, most genuinely happy, they are usually the ones who perform the least, who let themselves be seen, who risk authenticity despite its costs. That risk is worth taking. Seventh, use whatever privilege you have to change systems, not just to succeed within them. This is the difference between Alva Vanderbilt, the social climber, and Alva Belmont, the suffragist. Early Alva used her privilege to break into an existing system. Later, Alva used her privilege to change the system itself, to make it better for people who had come after her. That second use of privilege is the one that matters, the one that lasts. Whatever privilege you have, whether it is wealth or education or connections or just being in a position where you are heard, use some of it to make systems more fair, more inclusive, more just. Do not just climb the ladder. Question whether the ladder should exist, and if it should, work to make it accessible to more people. This can be small scale, mentoring someone who does not have your advantages, speaking up when you see unfairness, using your voice to amplify people who are not heard, or it can be large scale, donating to causes that address systemic problems, organizing for change, building alternative structures, The point is to recognize that individual success, while valuable, is not enough. Real meaning comes from contributing to collective progress, from leaving things better than you found them, from using your position to help others rather than just maintaining your position. Eighth, preserve stories that would otherwise be lost. We know so much about the social queens because they were wealthy enough to be documented, but we know so little about the servants, about working class people, about marginalized communities, about anyone who was not in the rooms where history was officially recorded. You can change that pattern in small ways. Record the stories of your family members before they are gone, especially the older ones, the immigrants, the ones who worked invisible jobs, the ones whose stories nobody thought to preserve. Ask questions, write things down, save photographs, create archives of voices that would otherwise disappear. And when you consume history, when you read or watch documentaries or visit museums, always ask who is missing from the story, whose perspective is not represented, whose labor made this possible. Make an active effort to seek out the stories that were not officially preserved, because every story we lose is a piece of human experience that disappears forever. And the stories of ordinary people, struggling people, marginalized people, those are often the most valuable, the most instructive, the most necessary for understanding how the world actually works. Ninth, embrace complexity, resist simplicity. Throughout this story, I have tried to show you that these women were neither heroes nor villains. They were complex humans making complicated choices in difficult circumstances, and that complexity is important. Because life is complex, people are complex, systems are complex, and simple narratives are almost always misleading. So practice holding contradictions. Practice acknowledging that something can be both impressive and harmful, that someone can do good things and bad things, that systems can benefit some people while harming others, that progress and problems can coexist. This complexity is not confusion, it is clarity. It is seeing the full picture instead of a simplified version, and seeing fully allows you to think more clearly, to make better decisions, to engage with the world as it actually is, rather than as you wish it were. Simple narratives are comforting, but they are rarely true, and operating from false simplicity leads to bad outcomes. So choose complexity, choose nuance, choose the harder work of really understanding rather than the easy comfort of clear heroes and villains. And finally, remember that everything changes, including you, and that is okay. The social queens built their entire lives around maintaining a specific identity in a specific system, and when that system changed, they could not adapt. They were too invested in how things were, too committed to old patterns, too resistant to evolution. Do not make that mistake. Give yourself permission to change, to grow, to admit when something that used to work no longer works, to let go of identities that no longer fit, to reimagine yourself as many times as necessary. The person you are today does not have to be the person you will be in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. Your values might evolve, your priorities might shift, your understanding might deepen. That is not failure. That is growth. That is being alive. So hold your beliefs lightly. Question your assumption regularly. Stay curious about yourself. Remain open to transformation, because the ability to change is one of the most valuable abilities you can develop. It is what allows you to navigate an unpredictable world, to respond to new challenges, to keep becoming more fully yourself. These 10 pieces of wisdom, these invitations, they are distilled from hours of thinking about the social queens and their world, from seeing what worked and what did not, from understanding the costs of their choices and the benefits they might have gained by choosing differently. You do not have to accept all of this. You might disagree with some of it. That is fine. What matters is that you think about it, that you use their stories as mirrors to examine your own life, your own choices, your own path, because that's what history is for, not to memorize dates and names, not to pass tests or show off knowledge, but to learn from other people's experiences, to see patterns, to gain perspective, to make better choices than the people who came before us. The social queens of the Gilded Age lived in a very different world than ours, but they faced challenges that are remarkably similar. Questions about identity and authenticity, struggles with performance and approval, temptations of wealth and status, costs of ambition, the search for meaning, the desire for legacy. We can learn from their successes and their failures. We can admire their achievements while acknowledging their flaws. We can see them fully as complex humans navigating difficult circumstances, and in seeing them clearly, we can see ourselves more clearly too. So as we close this story, as we leave behind the ballrooms and mansions and all the drama of Gilded Age high society, I want to leave you with one final thought. You are building a life every day with every choice you make, every relationship you invest in, every value you uphold or compromise, every moment of authenticity or performance, every time you choose kindness or cruelty, every instance of standing up or staying silent. And that life you are building, it is your legacy. Not necessarily to history with a capital H. Most of us will not be remembered beyond a few generations, but to the people whose lives intersect with yours, to the communities you are part of, to the world you move through and influence in small ways every single day. What kind of life do you want to build? What values do you want it to express? What impact do you want it to have? Those are the questions that matter. Those are the choices that define you. The social queens had enormous wealth and power and still struggled to build meaningful lives. You probably have less wealth and less power, but you have something they often lacked: freedom, options, the ability to choose authenticity, to define success on your own terms, to build a life that actually reflects who you are rather than who you think you should be. That is an enormous privilege and an enormous responsibility. Use it wisely, use it bravely, use it to create something real and true and yours. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the Gilded Age, through the lives of women who wielded power in the only ways available to them, through the beauty and ugliness of extreme wealth, through the rise and fall of an entire social system, through lessons that echo across more than a century. I hope you found something valuable in these stories, something that made you think, something that challenged you, something that inspired you, something that helped you see your own life from a different angle. If you did, I would love to hear about it. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, tell me which part of this story resonated with you, or challenged you, or surprised you. I read every comment and I genuinely want to know what you're taking away from this. And if you enjoyed this journey, if you found value in these stories and lessons, consider subscribing to the channel, because there are so many more stories like this. Stories of forgotten people who shaped history, stories that teach us about ourselves, stories that deserve to be remembered and explored and learned from. History is not just about the past. It is about understanding patterns that repeat, about learning from other people's experiences, about gaining wisdom that we can apply to our own lives, and I am committed to bringing you those stories, those lessons, that wisdom. So stay tuned. There are more journeys ahead, more forgotten queens to remember, more lessons to extract, more perspectives to explore, and I would love for you to come along. Until next time, remember this: you are not just living a life, you are creating a legacy. Make it one you can be proud of. Make it one that reflects your truest values. Make it one that contributes something good to the world. Make it authentically, courageously, beautifully yours. Thank you for listening. Thank you for thinking. Thank you for being here. And I will see you in the next story.